For much of history, the Phoenicians have remained a mystery, an ancient people without an empire, a language with few surviving texts, and a legacy often overshadowed by their more famous neighbors. Yet without them, the modern world might not read or write as it does today. Who were the Phoenicians? And how did a network of small coastal cities give rise to one of the most influential trading cultures in the ancient Mediterranean? Their story is not just one of trade routes and treaties. It's about how ideas move, how connections are built, and how even small nations can leave an outsized mark on history. Let's begin. The story of the Phoenicians begins long before they were called by that name. Along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea, in a region known today as Lebanon, western Syria, and northern Israel, small coastal settlements began to emerge during the 3rd millennium BCE. These settlements were the descendants of Canaanite peoples who had lived in the Levant for centuries. They would later give rise to the Phoenician civilization. Archaeological evidence shows that by around 3000 BCE, a number of early towns were already active along the narrow coastal plain between the sea and the Lebanon mountains. Among the earliest and most important was Byblos, which would later become a center of trade, religion, and culture. Excavations at Byblos have revealed monumental architecture, imported Egyptian goods, and evidence of a thriving urban society by the early Bronze Age. These early communities were shaped by geography. The coastline of the Levant is broken by natural harbors, ideal for small boats, but hemmed in by rugged mountains and limited farmland. This environment did not lend itself to large agricultural empires. Instead, the people here turned to the sea. Fishing, small-scale farming, and coastal trade defined their economy. Their location, situated between Egypt to the south and Mesopotamia to the east, made them natural intermediaries in regional commerce. Byblos, in particular, established close ties with Egypt during the Old Kingdom period. By the 27th century BCE, Egyptian texts refer to Byblos as a major source of timber, especially the valuable cedar wood that Egypt lacked. Cedars from Lebanon were floated as rafts down the coast to supply the construction of temples and ships. In return, the people of Byblos received Egyptian gold, papyrus, and luxury goods. Some Biblian rulers adopted Egyptian styles and titles, suggesting a high degree of cultural exchange and political cooperation. One of the best examples of this relationship comes from the tomb of King Abibaal of Byblos, who ruled around the early 2nd millennium BCE. A statue dedicated to him bears hieroglyphic inscriptions indicating strong Egyptian influence. His son, King Elibal, also appears in Egyptian records, continuing this connection. These references are among the earliest named individuals tied to what would later become the Phoenician world. While Egypt was the dominant southern power, the peoples of the Levant also interacted with Mesopotamian states to the east. Trade routes linked cities like Mari and Ebla to inland Syria and eventually to the coast. This meant that the early Phoenician cities were not isolated. They stood at the crossroads of major civilizations, absorbing influences and goods from all directions. The people who lived in these coastal cities during the Bronze Age did not yet see themselves as Phoenicians. That term would come much later, used by the Greeks. Instead, they would have identified with their city, Biblian, Sidonian, Tyrian, or simply as Canaanites. But even in these early centuries, certain cultural traits began to appear that would define the Phoenicians: skilled craftsmanship, long-distance trade, a deep connection to the sea, and a decentralized system of city-states rather than a unified kingdom. Another important characteristic of these communities was their religious structure. Temples to local gods were often located at the center of town. Each city had its own patron deity, though many shared features and names across the region. These gods would later become central figures in Phoenician religion, but even in the early Bronze Age, their presence suggests a complex spiritual life intertwined with civic identity. During the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, trade and urban development in the region slowed due to a series of disruptions. Climate shifts, regional conflicts, and the collapse of certain trade partners may have contributed. But by the early 2nd millennium BCE, urban life resumed and expanded. Cities grew larger and more organized. In Byblos, massive stone structures and defensive walls were built. New ports and docks emerged along the coast, and shipbuilding techniques improved. These developments laid the groundwork for what would become one of the ancient world's most effective maritime networks. As cities like Byblos and its neighbors developed, they maintained a flexible and outward-looking economy. This was not a region of rigid hierarchies or land-based empires. Power rested in the hands of local elites, often merchant families or priest kings, who relied on their control of trade routes and commercial agreements rather than military conquest. This model would persist for centuries and allow the Phoenicians to adapt quickly to shifting political landscapes. It is important to note that the Phoenicians did not invent everything from scratch. They borrowed, adapted, and transmitted ideas from the cultures around them. Their writing system, which would later evolve into the Phoenician alphabet, drew inspiration from earlier Canaanite and Egyptian symbols. Their art and architecture also show clear links to both Egyptian and Mesopotamian styles. Yet over time, they developed a distinct cultural identity built on synthesis, flexibility, and exchange. As the early Bronze Age faded and the 2nd millennium BCE unfolded, the Levantine coast underwent a slow but steady transformation. Byblos, once the dominant port and diplomatic hub, gradually saw its central role diminish. Other coastal cities, smaller in earlier centuries, began to rise in prominence. Among these were Sidon and Tyre, two names that would soon become synonymous with Phoenician power and expansion. The decline of Byblos was not abrupt or dramatic. Rather, it reflected broader shifts in regional trade, political alliances, and internal organization. As Egypt's influence weakened during its first intermediate period, the steady flow of Egyptian goods and officials to Byblos diminished. Without this lifeline, Byblos could no longer maintain its privileged position in the Eastern Mediterranean trade system. This opened the door for other cities to assert themselves. Further south along the coast, Sidon began to flourish. Unlike Byblos, which had been closely aligned with Egypt, Sidon cultivated a more diversified network of trading partners. Its port was well positioned to reach both inland trade routes and maritime channels. The surrounding region offered valuable natural resources, especially access to cedar forests and fertile valleys. Sidonian merchants grew increasingly active in the movement of goods such as metals, textiles, pottery, and timber. Not long after Sidon's ascent, Tyre also emerged as a dynamic urban center. Situated on a rocky island just off the coast, Tyre's natural defensibility became one of its most important assets. Over time, the island city was linked to the mainland by causeways and infrastructure, but in its early years, the sea itself served as a barrier against invasion. Tyre's location made it both a strategic port and a safe haven, an ideal combination for a maritime society. While archaeological records from this era are limited, we know from later texts that Tyre and Sidon operated as independent city-states. Each had its own royal family, temples, military forces, and merchant fleets. Yet they were bound together by shared language, religion, and cultural heritage. This pattern, political independence combined with cultural unity, defined the Phoenician world from its inception. These city-states did not pursue conquest like the empires of Mesopotamia or Egypt. Instead, their power came from trade, craftsmanship, and navigation. Their influence spread through commerce rather than force. This model of development encouraged flexibility. When one trade route faltered, they explored another. When one partner declined, they sought out new alliances. Between 2000 and 1500 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean entered a complex period of international interaction. Egypt, recovering during its Middle Kingdom, reasserted its authority in the Levant. The Amorites had established themselves across much of Syria and Mesopotamia, bringing new dynasties and diplomatic connections. The Hittites to the north in Anatolia also began to project power southward. In this environment, the Phoenician cities navigated the shifting currents with skill. They avoided direct conflict with larger empires, instead offering goods, naval support, and tribute in exchange for autonomy. This strategy kept them largely independent while allowing their economies to flourish. It also fostered a culture of negotiation, adaptability, and long-term thinking. Sidon during this period appears to have been the leading city-state. Several ancient sources refer to Sidon as the firstborn of Phoenicia, a poetic way of acknowledging its early prominence. Its artisans became renowned for their glassware, textiles, and carved ivory. Sidonian sailors ventured across the Mediterranean, bringing home exotic materials and spreading local goods abroad. As Sidon grew in wealth and stature, it invested in monumental architecture, including temples, palaces, and harbor installations. Urban planning improved, with organized streets and public spaces. A ruling elite emerged, centered around hereditary kingship but supported by powerful merchant families. This blend of political and commercial leadership would become a hallmark of Phoenician city governance. Meanwhile, Tyre steadily expanded its influence. While smaller in population than Sidon at this stage, Tyre had begun to develop a powerful maritime fleet. Tyrian ships were built with cedar from inland forests and designed for long voyages across rough waters. Their durability and speed gave Tyrian merchants an edge in far-reaching trade missions. Over time, Tyre would use its fleet to build trade links not only with Egypt and Mesopotamia, but also with Cyprus, Anatolia, and eventually the Aegean. Another factor that contributed to the rise of these cities was technological innovation. During this period, metalworking techniques advanced significantly. Bronze became more widely used, and demand for tin and copper, its two components, increased. The Phoenician cities positioned themselves as key intermediaries in the bronze trade. They sourced copper from Cyprus, tin from distant western lands, and distributed finished goods across the Mediterranean. Their control over this trade allowed them to accumulate wealth and political leverage. Religious life also played a central role in the development of these cities. Each city had its own patron deity, whose temple formed the spiritual and symbolic heart of the urban space. In Sidon, the goddess Astarte held a place of prominence, while Tyre's protector was Melkart, a god associated with kingship, the sea, and the underworld. These deities were not isolated figures. They were part of a broader Canaanite pantheon shared across the region. Temples functioned not only as religious centers but also as administrative hubs and treasuries. Religious festivals helped unite communities and reinforce civic identity. They also attracted pilgrims, dignitaries, and traders from other regions, strengthening cultural exchange. As these festivals grew in importance, they contributed to the prestige of the host cities, enhancing their reputation throughout the Levant. It is during this same period that the groundwork was laid for the creation of the Phoenician alphabet. Though the fully developed script would not appear until later, early writing systems based on pictographs and syllabic symbols began to circulate. Merchants and scribes needed simple, flexible ways to record transactions, contracts, and inventories. These early experiments with writing foreshadowed a major innovation that would emerge in the next few centuries. By the middle of the second millennium BCE, long before Tyre and Sidon would reach their peak influence, it was the ancient city of Byblos that remained the central figure in Phoenician interactions with the great powers of the ancient Near East, particularly Egypt. The relationship between Byblos and Egypt was not merely one of trade. It was a complex and long-standing alliance that shaped the economic and cultural development of the Levant and contributed to the consolidation of power in both regions. Byblos, located on the coast of what is now Lebanon, had already developed a reputation as a center for the export of cedar wood, a material that Egypt desperately needed. Egypt, lacking sufficient timber in its own desert landscapes, turned to Byblos for its supply of large and durable cedar trees, particularly those grown in the Lebanon mountains. These trees were essential for constructing temples, palaces, ships, and coffins, all crucial elements of Egyptian religious and political life. The earliest references to this relationship appear in Egyptian texts dating back to the Old Kingdom, especially during the reigns of the pharaohs of the 5th and 6th dynasties. around the 25th to 23rd centuries BCE. But by the time of Egypt's Middle Kingdom, particularly under the rule of pharaohs such as Senusret I and Senusret III, the ties between Byblos and Egypt had deepened and become institutionalized. Egyptian officials referred to Byblos as Kepni or Kbn, and many trade expeditions were sent from the Nile Valley to its harbors. Byblos, in turn, became heavily influenced by Egyptian culture. Egyptian religious practices, artistic styles, and royal iconography appeared in Biblian temples and royal tombs. Local kings adopted Egyptian titles and used hieroglyphic inscriptions to record their reigns. One such ruler, Abibal of Byblos, left behind a statue inscribed in Egyptian hieroglyphs, dedicating it to the Egyptian god Osiris. His successor, Elibal, also maintained strong ties with Egypt and oversaw a continuation of this diplomatic relationship. This adoption of Egyptian motifs was not a sign of cultural subservience, but a deliberate political strategy. Biblian kings recognized the benefits of aligning themselves with one of the most powerful civilizations of the time. In return for timber and other luxury goods, including wine, olive oil, and crafted goods, Byblos received gold, ivory, papyrus, and other Egyptian imports that enhanced the city's prestige and economic strength. The temples of Byblos, especially the Temple of Balat Gebal, stand as testaments to this cultural fusion. Balat Gebal, the Lady of Byblos, was the city's patron goddess and was often associated with Hathor and Isis, prominent goddesses in the Egyptian pantheon. Egyptian-style statues, amulets, and carvings have been found in her temple precinct, suggesting that rituals and religious symbolism blended elements from both traditions. Beyond religion, this close relationship had strategic implications. Egypt viewed Byblos not just as a supplier of wood, but as a reliable partner on the Levantine coast, an outpost of influence. Egyptian traders, scribes, and envoys likely lived in Byblos or visited regularly. Their presence introduced Egyptian administrative systems and may have influenced the development of local record-keeping and economic management. Meanwhile, the craftsmen of Byblos refined their skills in ivory carving, goldsmithing, and pottery, often producing items that reflected both local styles and Egyptian techniques. These goods were shipped along maritime routes reaching south to Egypt and north toward Anatolia and Syria, cementing Byblos's role as a key node in the interregional trade network. One of the most remarkable insights into the connection between Byblos and Egypt comes from the so-called Byblos syllabary, an early writing system found on bronze tablets and inscribed objects from the city. Though not fully deciphered, these texts suggest an early attempt to create a writing system that was distinct from both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Mesopotamian cuneiform. While the true development of the Phoenician alphabet would occur later, these early experiments point to a growing intellectual environment in which trade, language, and writing were becoming deeply intertwined. The prosperity of Byblos during this period was not limited to Egypt. The city also engaged in trade with other nearby regions, including the Hittite Empire to the north and the Amorite kingdoms of inland Syria. However, it was the Egyptian connection that defined its international status. The city's elite managed to balance their independence with a loyalty that kept them in Egypt's good graces. But no golden age lasts forever. By the end of the Middle Bronze Age, around the 15th century BCE, regional dynamics began to shift. The rise of the Hittites in Anatolia, the growing influence of Mitanni in northern Mesopotamia, and the internal changes in Egypt during the transition from the Middle to the New Kingdom introduced new uncertainties. Furthermore, other cities along the coast, most notably Sidon and Tyre, began to grow rapidly. These cities, less dependent on Egypt and more engaged in broader Mediterranean trade, gradually pulled influence away from Byblos. They offered new models of urban organization, prioritized naval power, and explored different trade opportunities that were not centered around Egyptian demand. Still, Byblos retained its religious significance and its reputation as an ancient, venerable city. Greek historians centuries later would refer to it with respect and fascination. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described visiting the city and witnessing ceremonies tied to the myth of Osiris, evidence that even after its political influence waned, Byblos maintained cultural authority in the region. Among the many contributions the Phoenicians made to the ancient world, perhaps none was more influential or more enduring than the invention of the alphabet. This remarkable achievement emerged not from royal decree or imperial ambition, but from the practical needs of merchants, sailors, and scribes living in a world of expanding trade and growing complexity. Around the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, and likely solidifying by the 11th century BCE, the Phoenicians developed a revolutionary new script, one that would eventually become the foundation for nearly every alphabet used in the modern world. Before this innovation, writing systems in the ancient Near East were intricate and reserved largely for elite functions. In Mesopotamia, scribes wrote cuneiform, a dense and highly stylized script using hundreds of signs. In Egypt, hieroglyphs combined pictorial and phonetic elements and required years of training to master. These writing systems served powerful state bureaucracies but were not easily accessible to ordinary people. For traders and seafarers who needed quick, reliable ways to record transactions and communicate across regions, such complex scripts were impractical. The Phoenicians responded to this need by creating something simpler, more flexible, and far easier to learn: a true alphabet made up of a small set of symbols, each representing a distinct consonantal sound. This new system, sometimes referred to by modern scholars as a proto-alphabet, did not include vowels, but it dramatically reduced the number of symbols one had to memorize, from hundreds to fewer than 30. This innovation did not emerge overnight. It evolved over time, influenced by earlier writing systems. Scholars believe that the Phoenician script drew from earlier Canaanite pictographs and possibly from Egyptian hieroglyphs, especially those used in inscriptions related to trade. The early versions of the script appear to have circulated first among merchants in port cities like Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre. Over time, the system was refined and standardized. By around 1050 BCE, the script had taken on a stable form. It consisted of 22 characters, each corresponding to a consonant sound. The letters were written from right to left, a direction still used in many modern Semitic scripts. While the Phoenicians did not invent the idea of writing itself, their alphabet was the first known to be widely used by ordinary people across various regions and for diverse purposes. One reason the Phoenician alphabet spread so rapidly was its practicality. Traders could use it to record goods exchanged, destinations, names of buyers and sellers, and terms of agreement. Sailors used it to label cargo and map routes. Priests inscribed it on temple offerings, and stonemasons carved it into building dedications. Unlike earlier scripts, which had remained closely tied to courtly scribes or religious elites, the Phoenician alphabet was functional, accessible, and adaptable. The first major archaeological evidence of this alphabet comes from inscriptions such as the Ahiram sarcophagus, found in Byblos, and dated to the early 1st millennium BCE. This royal tomb bears one of the earliest full examples of the Phoenician script, showing its use in formal commemorative contexts. Other inscriptions have been found on pottery, stone stelae, and metal artifacts scattered across the Mediterranean. The simplicity of the Phoenician script made it easy to adapt. As Phoenician merchants and colonists moved westward, they brought the alphabet with them. It soon reached Cyprus, Crete, and the Aegean world. Greek traders encountered it and began to modify it, adding vowel symbols to suit their own language. This Hellenized version of the script became the Greek alphabet, which in turn influenced the Latin alphabet used in much of the world today. The importance of this transition cannot be overstated. By reducing writing to a manageable set of symbols, the Phoenicians made literacy more attainable. This paved the way for wider record-keeping, contract writing, storytelling, and even the eventual preservation of philosophical and religious texts. The written word was no longer the exclusive domain of priests and bureaucrats. It was becoming a tool for sailors, artisans, shopkeepers, and poets. The The cultural significance of the alphabet also lies in how it reflects Phoenician values. Unlike imperial powers that used complex scripts to reinforce hierarchy and distance themselves from the common people, the Phoenicians created a tool that was democratic in function. This suited their decentralized world of independent city-states, where commerce rather than conquest was the engine of growth. In a world where sea captains needed to keep logs, where distant colonies needed to communicate with home ports, and where contracts had to be clear and binding, a practical alphabet was indispensable. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing many centuries later, credited the Phoenicians with bringing writing to Greece. While his account simplifies a complex historical process, it captures the essential truth. The Phoenicians were the transmitters of a powerful cultural technology. Their alphabet crossed seas, borders, and languages. It could be learned in weeks rather than years, and it fit neatly into the merchant bags and cargo holds of a mobile people. Even beyond the Greek world, the Phoenician alphabet had influence. Aramaic, the lingua franca of much of the Near East by the first millennium BCE, adapted its own script from Phoenician roots. Hebrew, another closely related Semitic language, adopted a variant. Over time, many alphabets across Eurasia, whether used for Semitic, Indo-European, or other language families, owed their lineage to the foundational work done by Phoenician scribes and traders. Importantly, this innovation also suggests a key dimension of Phoenician identity. While the Phoenicians are often remembered for their trade and navigation, their development of the alphabet shows their deep engagement with ideas, communication, and cultural transmission. They were not only moving goods, but also spreading systems of thought, practical tools, and symbols that would outlive their political autonomy by centuries. This alphabet, born out of economic necessity and refined by experience, outlasted the rise and fall of their city-states. It became part of the DNA of global communication. Long after the last Phoenician king had vanished from the historical record, the script developed by their people continued to shape how others recorded their own histories, laws, and stories. As the first millennium BCE dawned, the balance of power among the Phoenician city-states began to shift. Byblos, though still culturally significant, had declined in political and economic influence. In its place, two rising stars competed for regional dominance: Sidon and Tyre. These sister cities, only a short distance apart along the coast of modern-day Lebanon, would define much of Phoenicia's political history for the next several centuries. Their rivalry, cooperation, and alternating periods of dominance marked a new phase in the evolution of Phoenician civilization. Sidon was the older of the two cities and had long enjoyed a reputation for wealth, fine craftsmanship, and maritime success. The Egyptians had once referred to Sidon with admiration, and even Greek authors, writing centuries later, acknowledged its antiquity and prosperity. Sidonian artisans produced high-quality glassware, dyed textiles, and ivory carvings that were traded throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The city's port was bustling with merchant ships, and its coastal location offered easy access to inland trade routes as well. Tyre, by contrast, had a less prominent early history but rapidly gained in stature due to its natural defensibility and bold maritime strategies. Built originally on a rocky island less than a kilometer off the mainland, Tyre was protected by the sea on all sides. This insular geography would prove critical in times of conflict. Over time, the Tyrians expanded to the mainland as well, constructing a second port and agricultural zone that complemented the island city. The rivalry between Sidon and Tyre did not lead to open war, at least not in the surviving records, but it was marked by competition for prestige, trade dominance, and political alliances. Both cities maintained their own royal houses and local institutions. However, their commercial networks increasingly overlapped, especially in the lucrative trade of purple-dyed textiles, timber, metals, and luxury goods. The production of purple dye, extracted from the murex sea snail, was a key industry for both cities. This dye was not only costly and labor-intensive to produce, but also highly sought after by elites from Egypt to Mesopotamia. The term Phoenician itself, as used by the Greeks, likely derived from a word meaning purple, a reflection of how closely this industry was associated with the coastal Levantine traders. While both Sidon and Tyre were active in this trade, Tyre in particular became famous for its purple fabrics, sometimes called Tyrian purple, which adorned royal courts across the region. Political prestige often followed economic success. During the 11th and 10th centuries BCE, Sidon appears to have held the upper hand. Several ancient sources refer to Sidon as the mother of cities, implying a leading role in Phoenician colonization and maritime activity during this period. Sidonian ships reached Cyprus, the Aegean, and even the North African coast, laying the groundwork for future settlements. However, Tyre was not far behind. The city's leaders pursued aggressive trade policies and established a powerful navy. Unlike other Phoenician cities that focused on short to medium-range trade, Tyre began to look farther westward. This forward-thinking approach would, in time, propel Tyre into a dominant position across the Mediterranean. By the late 10th century BCE, Tyre had overtaken Sidon in both political and commercial influence. This shift is reflected in a number of historical sources, including biblical references that mention the close relationship between Tyre and the Israelite kingdom under King David and King Solomon. According to the biblical account, King Hiram of Tyre supplied timber, artisans, and gold to help Solomon construct the temple in Jerusalem. While the exact historical details remain debated, the reference suggests a high level of wealth and regional influence. King Hiram of Tyre, who ruled in the 10th century BCE, is often credited with consolidating Tyre's maritime strength. He organized harbor infrastructure, improved urban defenses, and fostered trade partnerships with neighboring kingdoms. Hiram's reign represents a turning point, when Tyre truly emerged as the political and economic leader among the Phoenician city-states. This rise to prominence was not solely due to internal governance or craftsmanship. Geography played a significant role. Tyre's island base was less vulnerable to land-based invasions, allowing it to preserve its autonomy even as larger empires began to expand into the region. This strategic advantage gave Tyre the stability needed to invest in long-distance trade, shipbuilding, and exploration. As Tyre ascended, Sidon did not vanish from the historical record. It remained an important city with its own thriving economy and cultural output. However, it increasingly played a secondary role compared to Tyre's expanding influence. Tyre's political leadership began to speak not just for itself, but often for the wider Phoenician network. Its kings negotiated directly with foreign powers, its ships dominated key sea routes, and its colonies, most notably Carthage, carried Tyrian customs, deities, and governance models to new shores. The internal structure of these cities also sheds light on their growing complexity. Phoenician city-states like Sidon and Tyre were monarchies, typically ruled by kings who claimed divine favor and ruled in conjunction with powerful aristocratic families. These elites controlled trade guilds, religious temples, and naval operations. The king was often seen as the guardian of the city's patron deity, Astarte in Sidon and Melkart in Tyre. These gods were not only objects of worship, but also symbols of civic identity and legitimacy. Religion and politics were closely linked. Temple complexes served as centers of both spiritual and administrative life. Offerings, contracts, and diplomatic messages might all pass through the hands of priests. The close alignment between religious authority and political power helped solidify the social structure and gave the ruling class additional legitimacy in the eyes of the population. Despite their rivalry, Sidon and Tyre shared more than they competed over. They spoke the same language, followed similar religious practices, used the same alphabet, and participated in joint trade ventures. Their combined efforts strengthened the overall Phoenician presence in the Mediterranean and helped standardize Phoenician influence across distant regions. This cooperation was especially evident in maritime exploration. As Phoenician ships began to sail farther west, toward Sicily, Sardinia, and the Iberian Peninsula, it is likely that both Sidonian and Tyrian merchants participated. While Tyre would later take the lead in colonial expansion, The foundational voyages often involved sailors and knowledge from both cities. By the early 9th century BCE, Tyre had emerged as the preeminent city among the Phoenician city-states. With its well-defended island location, dynamic leadership, and growing commercial power, Tyre transitioned from a regional trade hub into a maritime empire with influence stretching across the entire Mediterranean. Its rise marked a turning point not only for the Phoenicians, but also for the broader ancient world, as Tyrian ships, merchants, and settlers played a crucial role in connecting civilizations and reshaping long-distance trade. Tyre's dominance was rooted in its control of the sea. The city's island harbor, shielded from land-based threats and optimized for naval activity, allowed for the construction and maintenance of large fleets. By this time, Tyrian shipbuilders had mastered the art of crafting vessels suited for both cargo and long-distance travel. Their ships, known for their speed, strength, and versatility, became symbols of Phoenician enterprise. The famous Gaulois and Hippoi were two such ship types, one designed for transport and the other for swift maneuvering in both trade and conflict. This growing naval capability allowed Tyre to expand its trade networks far beyond the eastern Mediterranean. Tyrian merchants, carrying goods such as purple-dyed textiles, glassware, fine ceramics, and precious metals, began to establish outposts across Cyprus, the Aegean Islands, the coastlines of North Africa, and as far west as the Iberian Peninsula. In return, they brought home silver from Spain, tin from the British Isles, amber from the Baltic, and exotic goods from the African interior. A key factor in Tyre's success was the city's ability to coordinate long-range expeditions while maintaining internal stability. Its kings ruled in conjunction with powerful merchant families, whose commercial ventures formed the backbone of Tyrian expansion. Governance in Tyre was a partnership between the royal house and the economic elite, each dependent on the other for prosperity and protection. This cooperative model encouraged innovation and reinvestment into naval infrastructure, including shipyards, docks, and storage facilities. During this period, Tyre also developed a highly organized system for managing maritime trade. Naval convoys were coordinated to reduce piracy risk. Cargo was inventoried at central depots, and contracts were recorded using the Phoenician alphabet. These logistical tools allowed Tyrian merchants to operate across vast distances with confidence and efficiency. It was not an empire in the traditional territorial sense, but rather a thalassocracy, a dominion based on control of sea routes and economic influence. Religion also played a role in binding this expanding network together. The god Melkart, Tyre's patron deity, came to embody the city's identity and ambitions. Melkart was often portrayed as a divine king, a master of the sea, and a protector of commerce. Temples dedicated to Melkart were built not only in Tyre but also in overseas settlements, acting as spiritual and cultural outposts. These sanctuaries helped preserve Tyrian customs and served as meeting places for Phoenician merchants abroad. Tyre's growing confidence on the world stage is further reflected in its diplomatic activities. Kings of Tyre negotiated treaties and partnerships with neighboring states, including the rising Israelite monarchy. The biblical account of King Hiram's alliance with King Solomon of Israel, though not confirmed in full by archaeological evidence, points to a period of high-level cooperation between the two powers. According to the biblical narrative, Hiram provided materials and skilled labor for the construction of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, while Solomon opened inland markets to Tyrian merchants. This interaction was not isolated. Tyre maintained friendly relations with several major powers of the time, including Egypt, Assyria, and the Hittite successor states. Rather than engaging in military conflict, Tyre leveraged its economic importance and naval expertise to secure favorable diplomatic positions. Tribute arrangements, mutual defense pacts, and trade agreements allowed Tyre to operate independently while avoiding the fate of many other small states caught between empires. As Tyre's power expanded, it also assumed a leadership role among the other Phoenician cities. Though each city remained politically independent, Tyre became a central point of coordination, especially for overseas colonization. Merchant fleets and colonists often set sail under Tyrian organization, and new settlements maintained ties to the city through trade, religion, and shared cultural practices. Perhaps the most significant example of this expansion was the founding of Carthage, traditionally dated to the late 9th century BCE. While this momentous event will be explored in more detail in a later section, its origins lie in Tyre's policy of supporting colonies to secure trade routes and resources. The foundation of Carthage was not simply a result of overpopulation or exile, as later myths suggested, but a strategic move to anchor Phoenician presence in the central Mediterranean. Alongside Carthage, Tyrian settlers founded numerous colonies and trade posts, including Kidion in Cyprus, Lixus in North Africa, and Gadir in southern Iberia. These outposts served multiple purposes. They provided access to raw materials, offered safe harbors for passing ships, and extended the reach of Tyrian goods and influence. Many of these settlements retained strong cultural connections to Tyre, using the Phoenician language and script, worshipping Melkart, and following Tyrian architectural and urban planning models. Tyre's maritime empire was not just about commerce, it was also about cultural transmission. As Tyrian ships visited ports across the Mediterranean, they brought with them not only goods, but also ideas, technologies, and practices. The spread of the Phoenician alphabet, as previously noted, was one of the most profound examples. But other elements, such as religious rituals, artisan techniques, and navigational knowledge, also flowed along these maritime routes. It is important to emphasize that Tyre's success rested on its ability to adapt. In a world of shifting alliances and emerging powers, the city avoided entanglements in land wars, choosing instead to focus on mobility, neutrality, and mutual benefit. This pragmatic approach allowed it to survive longer than many of its contemporaries. While commerce, seafaring, and craftsmanship defined much of Phoenician public life, it was religion that bound their society together across generations and geography. The Phoenicians did not build vast empires or monumental temples to proclaim their dominance. Instead, they created a deeply rooted spiritual system, embedded within every city, household, and harbor, that reflected their values and guided their actions. This religious identity helped maintain cohesion across the fragmented landscape of independent city-states and later extended to the farthest reaches of the Phoenician world. Phoenician religion shared many elements with the broader Canaanite belief system, which had developed in the Levant over many centuries. The Phoenicians inherited a complex pantheon of deities, each associated with particular aspects of nature, life, and governance. Unlike the monotheistic systems that would later dominate the region, the Phoenicians practiced polytheism, with gods and goddesses who were believed to dwell in temples, inhabit natural places, and influence human affairs in direct ways. Each Phoenician city had its own patron deity, who was regarded as both protector and ruler of the city. In Sidon, the primary goddess was Astarte, a deity of fertility, love, and war. In Tyre, Melkart served as the central god, associated with kingship, the sea, and the cycle of life and death. In Byblos, the goddess Baalat Gebal, literally Lady of Byblos, was venerated, often linked with Egyptian deities such as Hathor and Isis, due to the city's historical connections with Egypt. These gods were not just symbols of power, but were believed to be active participants in the lives of their worshippers. Offerings were made to them, festivals were held in their honor, and temples served as both religious and civic centers. The line between the spiritual and political spheres was thin. Kings ruled as representatives of their city's deity, and their authority was often legitimized through temple rituals, oaths, and divine approval. One of the most significant features of Phoenician religion was its adaptability. As Phoenician merchants and settlers moved across the Mediterranean, they carried their gods with them. Temples dedicated to Melkart, Astarte, and other deities appeared in colonies far from the Levant. In Carthage, for example, Melkart was worshipped under the name Baal Hammon, while Astarte merged with local deities and was eventually identified with Roman and Greek goddesses. This portability of faith allowed the Phoenicians to preserve their cultural identity even as they integrated into foreign environments. Temples served not only as places of worship but also as social and economic hubs. They housed treasuries, issued loans, and sometimes even mediated disputes. The priesthoods, drawn from elite families, played key roles in maintaining both religious tradition and civic order. Religious festivals were central to public life. These events often combined sacred rituals with community gatherings, music, and offerings. Some ceremonies were tied to agricultural cycles such as harvests and planting seasons, while others commemorated mythological events. For example, in Tyre, the death and resurrection of Melkart was marked by ritual mourning followed by celebration, symbolizing the renewal of life and the continuity of the city's power. The mythologies surrounding these gods reflected themes important to a seafaring and mercantile people. Melkart, for instance, was associated with journeys, storms, and navigation. In some stories, he traveled across the sea, faced death, and returned renewed, a metaphor that resonated deeply with Phoenician sailors who risked their lives on distant voyages. Astarte, as a goddess of fertility and war, embodied the dual nature of prosperity and conflict, reflecting the constant negotiation between growth and survival. Phoenician temples varied in form, but generally included an inner sanctum, known as the debir, a courtyard for offerings, and often an altar or high place for sacrifices. Unlike the towering ziggurats of Mesopotamia or the vast stone complexes of Egypt, Phoenician temples were often more modest in size, though richly adorned with imported materials, intricate carvings, and precious offerings. Stone stelae inscribed with dedications and prayers were commonly placed in temple precincts, providing valuable historical records of religious life and royal patronage. Sacrifices formed a core part of religious practice. These included offerings of animals, grain, wine, and incense. Inscriptions and archaeological evidence suggest that these rituals were highly structured and conducted according to specific liturgical formulas. Participants sought favor from the gods in times of illness, voyage, harvest, or war. Success in trade or battle was often attributed to divine support, and failed endeavors could trigger acts of repentance or additional offerings. One of the most debated aspects of Phoenician religion is the question of child sacrifice. Classical authors such as Diodorus Siculus, Plutarch, and others accused the Phoenicians, particularly the Carthaginians, of offering children to the gods in times of crisis. These accounts describe rituals where infants were burned or buried alive as offerings to Baal Hammon or Tanit. Archaeological sites in Carthage and elsewhere have revealed large burial grounds known as toppets, containing urns with the remains of young children and animals, often accompanied by votive inscriptions. Modern scholars remain divided on the interpretation of these findings. Some argue that the toppets were sites of ritual child sacrifice, particularly during moments of extreme danger such as war or famine. Others suggest that the remains reflect the burial of children who died naturally, and the accompanying rituals were commemorative rather than sacrificial. Regardless of the historical reality, the controversy reflects the stark differences between Phoenician religious practices and the moral frameworks of later Greek and Roman writers. Another unique dimension of Phoenician religion was the role of sacred kingship. In Tyre, for example, the king was not just a political leader, but also a high priest of Melkart. This dual role elevated the monarch's status and reinforced the belief that the city's fate was directly tied to the favor of its god. The temple and the palace were often located near each other, forming the spiritual and administrative heart of the city. Phoenician religious influence extended beyond their own communities. As they interacted with other cultures, their deities were absorbed and reinterpreted. The Greek god Heracles, for example, was closely associated with Melkart, and temples to Heracles were often built on sites previously dedicated to the Tyrian god. Similarly, Astarte was linked with the Greek Aphrodite and the Roman Venus. These cross-cultural associations allowed Phoenician religious ideas to permeate the broader Mediterranean world, influencing mythologies, rituals, and artistic representations. The role of women in Phoenician religion is another important, though less documented, topic. Goddesses such as Astarte and Tanit held powerful positions within the pantheon, suggesting that female divinity was central to Phoenician cosmology. Inscriptions and artifacts hint at the involvement of women in temple rituals, possibly as priestesses, musicians, or caretakers of sacred spaces. The prominence of female deities and the iconography associated with fertility and motherhood reflect a spiritual framework that valued both male and female expressions of divine power. Religious continuity also helped preserve Phoenician identity during times of political upheaval. When empires rose and fell, and when colonies grew distant from their homelands, shared rituals, deities, and myths helped maintain a sense of belonging. Even in later centuries, when Phoenician cities came under foreign rule or influence, they continued to uphold their religious traditions, adapting them when necessary, but never abandoning their core beliefs. As the first millennium BCE progressed, the Phoenicians embarked on one of the most defining and ambitious phases of their history, the era of overseas colonization. What had once been a network of coastal city-states in the eastern Mediterranean began to extend westward, linking distant shores through trade, migration, and cultural influence. Unlike the empires that would rise and fall around them, the Phoenicians expanded not by conquest, but by settlement, by building harbors, establishing trade posts, and founding self-sustaining communities across the Mediterranean basin. The roots of this colonial movement can be traced to several overlapping pressures and opportunities. The first was demographic. As coastal cities such as Tyre, Sidon, and Arwad grew in population and prosperity, space became increasingly limited. The narrow Levantine coast, wedged between the sea and the mountains, offered little room for urban expansion or large-scale agriculture. Establishing settlements abroad became an attractive solution for accommodating surplus population, providing access to new resources, and relieving internal economic stress. The second motivation was economic. The Phoenicians were already renowned merchants, trading extensively with Egypt, Cyprus, the Aegean, and Mesopotamia. But demand for raw materials, especially metals like silver, copper, tin, and iron, was growing. Many of these resources were found far from the Levant, in places such as the Iberian Peninsula, Sardinia, and North Africa. By establishing permanent outposts closer to these sources, Phoenician merchants could reduce transport costs, secure trade routes, and better manage supply chains. Third, there was the issue of security. The eastern Mediterranean was increasingly unstable during this period. The rise of Assyrian imperialism posed a looming threat to the autonomy of the Phoenician city-states. Although Tyre and its neighbors often managed to avoid outright conflict through diplomacy and tribute, the possibility of invasion or political domination was never far away. Founding colonies offered a form of insurance, a way to preserve Phoenician culture and commercial power beyond the reach of Near Eastern empires. Finally, religious and ideological factors played a role. Colonization was often accompanied by the construction of temples dedicated to Phoenician gods, particularly Melkart and Astarte. These temples not only served spiritual functions, but also acted as focal points for community identity. In some cases, colonization was seen as fulfilling a divine mission, spreading the influence of the city's patron deity to new lands. The earliest Phoenician settlements abroad were modest in scale. Many began as seasonal trading posts or anchorages where ships could resupply, repair, or shelter from storms. Over time, some of these evolved into full-fledged colonies with permanent populations, defensive walls, agricultural zones, and urban centers. The locations chosen were strategic, typically along navigable coasts, near natural harbors, and close to important resources or trade junctions. One of the first major regions to see Phoenician settlement was Cyprus. The city of Kition on the island's southern coast became a prominent Phoenician stronghold. Archaeological evidence suggests that Tyrians played a leading role in its development, integrating with local populations while maintaining their language, religion, and cultural practices. Kition served as a vital link between the Levant and the Aegean, and as a source of copper, a resource that had long attracted traders to the island. From Cyprus, Phoenician expansion moved westward to North Africa. Along the coast of what is now Tunisia, Libya, and Algeria, several small colonies were established. These included Utica, one of the oldest Phoenician settlements in the western Mediterranean, founded well before the more famous Carthage. Utica served as a commercial outpost and staging point for further exploration inland and along the coast. The settlements in this region often coexisted with local Berber populations, exchanging goods and technologies while maintaining distinct Phoenician identities. The next wave of colonization reached the western Mediterranean, where islands such as Sardinia and Sicily became centers of trade and competition. The Phoenicians established colonies such as Motia and Sulcis in these areas, often positioning themselves near local communities or rival Greek colonies. In these contested spaces, diplomacy and defense became as important as trade. Fortifications were built, alliances were negotiated, and cities adapted to the challenges of a multicultural frontier. Perhaps the most ambitious colonial move was the push into the Iberian Peninsula. Here, the Phoenicians founded settlements like Gadir, modern-day Cadiz, located on the Atlantic coast of southern Spain. Gadir was ideally placed to access both Atlantic maritime routes and the mineral-rich interior of the peninsula. Phoenician traders in Iberia dealt in silver, tin, and iron, as well as exotic goods such as amber and animal hides. The colony quickly grew into a prosperous urban center, complete with temples, public buildings, and extensive trade networks. What made the Phoenician colonial model unique was its flexibility. Unlike the Greeks, who often sent large groups of settlers under strict metropolitan oversight, Phoenician colonies were usually founded by merchant families or sponsored by specific city-states, especially Tyre. These settlements enjoyed considerable autonomy, operating as extensions of their home cities, but adapting to local conditions. There was no centralized imperial administration directing colonial policy. Each city pursued its own interests while maintaining cultural and religious ties to the broader Phoenician world. The impact of colonization on the indigenous populations of the Mediterranean was mixed. In some areas, the Phoenicians engaged in mutually beneficial trade and cultural exchange. Local elites adopted Phoenician writing, art styles, and religious practices. In other regions, tensions arose over control of land, resources, or trade. While Phoenician settlers were generally not aggressive conquerors, they did build fortified settlements and could defend their interests when necessary. Phoenician culture proved remarkably resilient in these new environments. Even far from the Levant, colonists continued to use the Phoenician alphabet, speak their native language, and worship their traditional gods. Temples to Melkart and Astarte dotted the colonial landscape, and religious festivals mirrored those held in the homeland. This shared cultural framework helped create a sense of unity and belonging among dispersed communities. At the same time, local influences shaped colonial life. In places like Sicily and Spain, Phoenician settlers adopted certain architectural features, culinary habits, and artistic motifs from their neighbors. This blending of cultures enriched Phoenician society and facilitated integration into diverse regional contexts. Among all the Phoenician colonies established during the era of westward expansion, none would achieve the power, fame, and longevity of Carthage. Founded by settlers from Tyre on the coast of North Africa, Carthage would grow to become not only the most prominent Phoenician city in the western Mediterranean, but eventually a great rival to Rome itself. Its foundation marks a major milestone in Phoenician history, a turning point when the influence of the eastern homeland began to be matched and later surpassed by the vigor of a new center in the west. According to later tradition, most notably preserved in Roman and Greek sources, Carthage was founded around the year 814 BCE. The most famous version of its founding story appears in the writings of Roman historians like Justin and Virgil, who describe a Tyrian princess named Alyssa, known to the Romans as Dido, fleeing political turmoil in her homeland. After a perilous journey across the sea, Alyssa and her followers are said to have landed on the North African coast, where they negotiated with the local Berber ruler for a parcel of land. Using her cunning, she obtained as much land as could be covered by a single ox hide, which she cleverly cut into thin strips to enclose a large area, thereby claiming the site where Carthage would rise. Though this tale is undoubtedly shaped by later myth-making and Roman literary invention, it preserves a core historical truth. Carthage was established by Tyrians and maintained deep cultural and religious ties to its eastern origins. The name Carthage itself derives from the Phoenician phrase Kart Hadasht, meaning new city, a reflection of both its recent foundation and its intended role as an extension of Tyrian power and identity. The location chosen for Carthage was highly strategic. Situated on a peninsula with natural harbors, the site offered excellent maritime access and strong defensive potential. It lay near rich agricultural lands and important trade routes, allowing for immediate economic viability. Its proximity to other Phoenician settlements in North Africa, such as Utica, further helped to anchor it within an existing network of trade and culture. From its earliest days, Carthage was more than just a trading post. The settlers who arrived from Tyre brought with them not only commercial ambitions, but also a full urban model. Archaeological excavations reveal that Carthage was carefully planned, with a walled citadel, temples, residential quarters, and infrastructure for harbor activity. The religious life of the city centered around the worship of Phoenician deities, particularly Melkart and Astarte, as well as Baal-Hamon and Tanit, two gods who would later become closely associated with the city's unique religious identity. As with many Phoenician colonies, Carthage maintained strong connections to its founding city, at least in its early years. Tribute was paid to Tyre, religious rites followed Tyrian patterns, and elite families traced their ancestry back to noble lineages in the Levant. However, due to the great distances involved and the shifting political situation in the east, Carthage increasingly began to operate with its own autonomy. In time, it would become not just a colony, but the leader of a new Western Phoenician world. The initial growth of Carthage was driven by a combination of trade, agriculture, and diplomacy. Carthaginian merchants established themselves along key trade routes connecting North Africa to the Western Mediterranean, while local farmers supplied grain, olives, wine, and livestock. The city's leaders cultivated alliances with surrounding Berber communities, intermarried with local elites, and created a stable base for further expansion. Unlike many of the earlier Phoenician colonies, Carthage quickly moved to establish its own sphere of influence. It sponsored the foundation of new settlements in Sardinia, western Sicily, and southern Spain, acting not just as a participant in Phoenician expansion, but as a central organizer. These efforts were often led by wealthy Carthaginian families or commercial guilds who saw both profit and prestige in extending their reach. One important innovation in Carthaginian colonial policy was its more centralized approach. While traditional Phoenician colonies had often operated with high degrees of independence, Carthage began to impose a level of coordination and control over its outposts. This allowed for more efficient defense, standardized trade practices, and greater diplomatic leverage. Over time, Carthage came to represent the interests of the entire Western Phoenician community. Carthage also developed a formidable navy to protect its interests and maintain control over sea routes. The city's shipbuilders inherited the advanced naval designs pioneered in Tyre but adapted them for local needs. Fast-moving triremes and cargo vessels became the backbone of Carthaginian power, allowing it to respond quickly to threats, support allies, and dominate trade across the Western Mediterranean. As Carthage grew, it began to encounter competition, especially from Greek colonies expanding into similar areas. In Sicily, the Greeks and Phoenicians often found themselves in close proximity, leading to a mixture of commerce and conflict. In Sardinia and southern Italy, similar tensions arose. Carthage's leaders responded with a combination of diplomacy and force, securing treaties with some Greek cities while defending their own colonies against encroachment. Carthage's rise also shifted the balance of Phoenician influence away from the Levant. While Tyre, Sidon, and the other eastern cities remained culturally significant, their political and economic reach was increasingly limited by the growing power of Assyria and, later, Babylon. Carthage, free from these eastern constraints, became the new center of Phoenician ambition and resilience. It preserved Phoenician language, religion, and customs, even as it developed its own distinct identity and institutions. The political structure of Carthage reflected both its Phoenician heritage and its local adaptations. The city was governed by a combination of elected magistrates, known as sufetes, and a powerful senate composed of elite families. This republican system allowed for shared governance, the representation of commercial interests, and a degree of internal stability that supported long-term growth. Religious leaders also played a key role, particularly those associated with the cults of Baal-Hamon and Tanit. Carthage's economy expanded rapidly, fueled by trade in metals, agricultural goods, textiles, and slaves. Its artisans became known for fine jewelry, ceramics, and glassware, while its ports buzzed with ships arriving from every corner of the Mediterranean. The city also became a center of knowledge and exploration, with Carthaginian sailors reputedly reaching as far as the Atlantic coast of Africa and possibly even beyond the Pillars of Hercules. As the Phoenician world extended its reach westward, it formed one of the most expansive and sophisticated trade networks in the ancient Mediterranean. This was not a centralized empire in the traditional sense. There were no borders drawn by armies or lands ruled by distant governors. Instead, the Phoenicians built what historians often refer to as a maritime or mercantile empire, a vast web of coastal cities, colonies, trade stations, and shipping routes that connected peoples, products, and ideas across thousands of kilometers. By the beginning of the 8th century BCE, this network was thriving. Carthage, although still in its early years, had already begun to exert influence over surrounding regions. Meanwhile, other Phoenician settlements dotted the shores of North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, the Balearic Islands, and the southern coasts of the Iberian Peninsula. These outposts formed a chain of safe harbors and market points through which goods could pass efficiently and securely. The success of this commercial empire relied on three essential factors: naval mastery, economic specialization, and cultural flexibility. The Phoenicians, particularly those based in Tyre and Carthage, developed durable, seaworthy vessels capable of carrying large cargoes and navigating the often unpredictable conditions of the open sea. Their ships could travel for weeks at a time, stopping at trusted ports to trade, resupply, and relay information. Over generations, these maritime routes became as familiar and dependable to Phoenician sailors as overland roads were to the empires of the Near East. The range of goods carried aboard these ships was vast. From the eastern Mediterranean, Phoenician merchants exported luxury items such as glass, dyed textiles, fine ceramics, carved ivory, and precious metals. These were highly sought after by elites across the Mediterranean. In return, they imported raw materials and specialty products from each region they reached. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Phoenicians tapped into rich sources of silver and iron. The mines of southern Spain, especially in regions such as Tartessos, became crucial suppliers for the eastern markets. Archaeological finds in the area reveal extensive Phoenician activity, including smelting facilities, trade goods, and inscriptions in the Phoenician script. The settlement of Gadir, known today as Cadiz, served as a major hub for this trade, acting as a gateway between the Atlantic coast and inland mining districts. In Sardinia and Corsica, Phoenician merchants obtained copper and other metals while also establishing agricultural estates that provided grain, wine, and olives. Sicily offered similar benefits with fertile soil and strategic harbors. Mocha, a Phoenician colony on the western coast of Sicily, became one of the most important cities in the central Mediterranean, complete with temples, housing districts, and defensive walls. North Africa, meanwhile, was not just a staging ground for maritime trade. It was also a major source of agricultural wealth. Carthage and its satellite settlements developed advanced farming systems including irrigation, crop rotation, and the cultivation of cereals, legumes, and fruit. These agricultural surpluses helped sustain growing urban populations and allowed for further investment in shipbuilding, trade, and public infrastructure. In the Balearic Islands in southern France, Phoenician contact opened up new markets. Here they traded with local communities, exchanging manufactured goods for amber, animal products, and other regional specialties. Their influence, while less visible than in the more established colonies, nonetheless helped shape the material culture of these regions. Artifacts bearing Phoenician inscriptions and stylistic elements have been found far inland, demonstrating the broad reach of their commerce. Importantly, this trade network did not operate through force. The Phoenicians, with few exceptions, did not conquer territory or establish large armies. Instead, they relied on diplomatic relations, mutual agreements, and intermarriage with local populations. They offered valuable goods and technologies, including writing systems, agricultural techniques, and metalworking knowledge. In return, they received access to local resources and protection for their trading stations. This approach helped them maintain peaceful relations with many of their neighbors. In places where Greek and Etruscan colonists were also active, such as Sicily and southern Italy, competition sometimes led to conflict. But even in these contested regions, the Phoenicians often found ways to coexist or negotiate truces. Their reputation for fairness and reliability in trade became one of their most important assets. Cultural exchange was another hallmark of the Phoenician trade empire. As merchants moved between regions, they carried not only goods, but also ideas. Religious beliefs, artistic styles, and language elements passed along these routes. The Phoenician alphabet, for instance, spread westward with their trade and was adapted by various local communities, including the Greeks and later the Etruscans. This process helped lay the foundation for the alphabet still used across the world today. Religious practices also traveled with the merchants. Temples dedicated to deities such as Melkart, Astarte, and Baal Hammon were built in colonial cities and sometimes even in foreign lands where the Phoenicians had no permanent presence. These religious centers served as both spiritual and cultural anchors, reinforcing a shared identity among dispersed Phoenician communities and connecting them to their homeland. To manage such a vast network, the Phoenicians developed sophisticated systems of record-keeping, finance, and communication. Contracts and commercial agreements were often inscribed using the Phoenician script. Weights and measures were standardized to ensure fair dealings, and merchant guilds or family firms coordinated shipping schedules and cargo distribution. These practices created a sense of order and reliability, allowing goods to flow across enormous distances with surprising regularity. Despite their success, the Phoenician trade empire was not without challenges. Piracy, natural disasters, and political instability could all disrupt trade routes. The growing presence of Greek colonies and the rising power of indigenous kingdoms in the Western Mediterranean introduced new competitors. In some areas, Phoenician settlements found themselves surrounded or pressured by local forces. Still, the adaptability and resilience of the Phoenician model allowed their commercial system to endure for centuries. Carthage, in particular, began to emerge as the nerve center of this trade empire. Its leaders coordinated military defense, enforced maritime law, and negotiated treaties with foreign powers. The city's strategic location and naval superiority enabled it to control key choke points in the Mediterranean, including the Straits of Sicily and the approaches to the Atlantic. Carthage also began to take a more active role in supporting and defending other Phoenician colonies, many of which came to rely on its protection and leadership. This transition from a network of independent trading cities to a more integrated Carthage-led system was a major development in the evolution of Phoenician power. It laid the groundwork for the emergence of Carthage as a true imperial power in its own right. But at this stage, the emphasis remained on trade, diplomacy, and shared prosperity. The Western Mediterranean trade empire, built by the Phoenicians, was one of the most remarkable economic systems of the ancient world. It connected distant cultures, enabled technological and artistic exchange, and demonstrated how commerce could serve as a foundation for political influence and cultural unity. At a time when most ancient states relied on conquest and centralization, the Phoenicians showed that cooperation, adaptability, and mobility could be just as effective in shaping the course of history. Yet behind the success of these networks lay the daily lives of the people who sustained them. Sailors, artisans, farmers, scribes, and traders. To fully understand the strength and character of Phoenician civilization, we must now turn our attention to those who lived and worked within its cities and colonies. Phoenician cities were usually built along coastlines, often with harbors carved into natural inlets or protected by man-made breakwaters. Urban planning varied by location, but most cities included walled precincts, religious temples, residential quarters, workshops, storage facilities, and public gathering spaces. Streets were narrow and winding, lined with multi-story houses made of stone or mud brick. Roofs were often flat, doubling as working or living spaces. The home was the core of Phoenician family life. Extended families frequently lived under one roof, with multiple generations sharing domestic responsibilities. Houses typically included a central courtyard that provided light and ventilation, as well as space for cooking, weaving, or conducting small-scale trade. Water was stored in cisterns or drawn from public fountains, and waste was managed through basic drainage systems that reveal a concern for urban hygiene and functionality. Family was not just a private institution, it was also the primary unit of social and economic identity. Merchant families passed on skills, contacts, and responsibilities through generations. In cities like Tyre and Carthage, elite families dominated local politics and religious life, holding positions on city councils or temple boards. These family lineages were often recorded on inscriptions and gravestones, highlighting both ancestry and public status. Social stratification was evident in Phoenician cities. At the top were royal families and aristocratic merchant houses, followed by skilled artisans, traders, sailors, and scribes. Below them were laborers, farmers, and enslaved people. Social mobility was possible, particularly for merchants and craftsmen who succeeded in trade or gained favor with the elite. But family background remained a significant factor in determining status and opportunity. Craftsmanship was one of the most respected professions in Phoenician society. Artisans produced a wide range of goods, including glassware, textiles, ivory carvings, metal jewelry, and ceramics. Phoenician glassblowing was especially renowned, with techniques that allowed for the creation of delicate vessels, beads, and decorative items in vivid colors. Dye production, particularly the extraction of purple dye from the murex sea snail, was both labor-intensive and highly profitable. Workshops for dyeing, glassmaking, and metalwork were often located near harbors, allowing for the direct export of finished goods. Markets were central to city life. In open squares or covered arcades, merchants sold produce, textiles, pottery, tools, perfumes, and imported items from across the Mediterranean. We know from archaeological and textual evidence that Phoenician traders not only exchanged goods, but also arranged contracts, loans, and partnership agreements, activities that reveal a well-developed understanding of commercial law and financial organization. Women played important roles in domestic and economic life, though their status varied depending on class and location. In elite families, women could own property, manage estates, and participate in religious rituals. Inscriptions and burial monuments mention women as landowners, priestesses, and benefactors. Among artisans and merchants, women were involved in textile production, food preparation, and market sales. While political power generally remained in male hands, women were far from invisible in Phoenician society. Education, while not universal, was valued in families involved in trade, administration, or temple service. Boys, especially those from merchant or scribal families, were taught to read and write using the Phoenician alphabet, a skill essential for recording inventories, maintaining correspondence, and inscribing religious dedications. Scribes were trained in bookkeeping, contracts, and diplomatic communication, making them indispensable to both commerce and governance. Religion permeated all aspects of daily life. Public festivals and private rituals marked the calendar year, with sacrifices, offerings, and processions honoring the gods. Household altars were common, where families made daily offerings of food, incense, or small figurines. Travelers and merchants often carried amulets or invoked deities for protection before voyages. Religious observance was not just a matter of piety, but a way of reinforcing community bonds, securing prosperity, and maintaining favor with the divine. Civic institutions varied between cities, but many Phoenician settlements were governed by a council of elders or magistrates drawn from leading families. In Tyre and Carthage, these institutions worked alongside or under the authority of a king or suffet, a title used in Carthage for senior magistrates. Public buildings and temples often featured inscriptions commemorating donations or decrees, offering glimpses into the legal and political systems that structured urban life. Law and justice were administered locally, often through councils or appointed judges. In disputes involving trade, property, or personal injury, parties could appeal to temple officials or civic leaders for resolution. Contracts and legal decisions were sometimes inscribed on stone or metal tablets, creating a public record of agreements and judgments. Death and burial customs reveal much about Phoenician beliefs and values. Tombs ranged from simple pit graves to elaborate stone sarcophagi, depending on status and wealth. The dead were often buried with offerings such as jewelry, tools, weapons, or imported goods, reflecting both their profession and their connection to the broader Mediterranean world. Funerary inscriptions commemorated the deceased's achievements, lineage, and piety, offering insight into how individuals wished to be remembered. Cultural expression in Phoenician cities extended to music, art, and storytelling. Though few literary texts survive, it is likely that oral traditions played a major role in preserving myths, historical narratives, and moral teachings. Music accompanied religious rituals and public festivals, with instruments such as lyres, flutes, and drums mentioned in archaeological contexts. Decorative art often blended Phoenician motifs with Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Greek influences, reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of their society. Diet in Phoenician households was shaped by geography and trade. Coastal cities enjoyed abundant seafood, along with grains, olives, grapes, figs, and legumes. Bread was a staple food, baked in communal ovens or home hearths. Meat, though more expensive, was consumed during festivals or by wealthier families. Beer and wine were common beverages, with wine playing a prominent role in religious and social life. The presence of enslaved individuals, though limited in records, was a reality of Phoenician cities. Enslaved people worked in households, workshops, and agricultural estates. They may have been captured in war, purchased through trade, or born into servitude. While they had few legal rights, some may have earned their freedom or been integrated into households over time. Security and defense were concerns in both the homeland and colonies. City walls, watchtowers, and guarded gates were common features. Naval forces, particularly in major ports like Tyre and Carthage, protected against piracy and foreign aggression. The absence of large standing armies meant that cities relied on militias and hired soldiers when conflicts arose, though their preference for diplomacy and trade often reduced the need for open warfare. Despite their widespread maritime presence and economic power, the Phoenicians were not an isolated people. Their cities lay nestled along a narrow corridor between the Mediterranean Sea and the mountains of the Levant, a region frequently contested by larger, land-based empires. Over the centuries, Phoenician city-states found themselves surrounded by ambitious powers. The Israelites and Arameans to the east, the Hittites, and later the Assyrians to the north, and the Egyptians pressing from the south. Yet, through a combination of diplomacy, adaptability, and strategic neutrality, the Phoenicians navigated this complex political environment with remarkable resilience. From their earliest centuries, Phoenician cities had interacted with neighboring cultures, sharing trade routes, exchanging cultural ideas, and sometimes clashing over territory or resources. However, unlike many contemporaries, the Phoenicians generally avoided open conflict unless absolutely necessary. They chose instead to build relationships that could preserve their autonomy while allowing them to pursue commercial interests. This pragmatic approach to foreign affairs was particularly important during the period from the 12th to the 9th century BCE, as the geopolitical landscape of the Near East shifted dramatically. The decline of the Egyptian New Kingdom reduced southern pressure on the Levant, while the collapse of the Hittite Empire opened new spaces in the north. In this transitional period, smaller states such as Israel, Judah, Aram Damascus, and the Neo-Hittite kingdoms emerged and began to assert themselves. The Phoenicians, especially those of Tyre and Sidon, responded by strengthening ties with nearby powers while keeping their independence intact. The alliance between Tyre and the Israelite kingdom under King David and King Solomon is one notable example. According to the biblical account, King Hiram of Tyre provided timber, artisans, and gold to help build the temple in Jerusalem, while in return, the Israelites granted access to inland markets and labor. Whether entirely accurate or partially symbolic, this account reflects a real pattern of regional diplomacy and mutual benefit. Phoenician trade routes ran through the highlands of Israel and beyond, and cities such as Samaria and Damascus became important nodes in these networks. In turn, Phoenician artisans and products found their way deep into inland markets, while raw materials such as timber, copper, and agricultural goods flowed back toward the coast. This two-way exchange not only enhanced economic stability, but also forged political partnerships grounded in mutual dependency rather than subjugation. Relations with the Arameans, who dominated much of inland Syria, were more complicated. As the Aramean states expanded, they occasionally clashed with coastal cities over border regions and trade routes. However, the lack of major recorded wars between Arameans and Phoenicians suggests that both sides preferred negotiation to conquest. Aramean kings valued access to Mediterranean ports, while Phoenicians needed peaceful access to inland caravan routes. Over time, a system of coexistence emerged, with each side respecting the boundaries and interests of the other. To the north, the remnants of the Hittite world posed little direct threat, but the growing power of the Assyrians soon changed the equation. From the 9th century BCE onward, the Neo-Assyrian Empire began to expand westward under rulers such as Ashur-Nasir-pal II, Shalmaneser III, and Tiglath-Pileser III. Their armies swept through Syria, incorporating Aramean kingdoms and moving ever closer to the Phoenician coast. Faced with this new and formidable threat, the Phoenicians once again chose diplomacy over resistance. Rather than engage in wars they were unlikely to win, cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos offered tribute to the Assyrian kings. In return, they were allowed to retain a significant degree of local autonomy. These arrangements were not without cost. Tribute demands could be heavy, and Phoenician cities were sometimes required to supply ships or labor for Assyrian military campaigns, but they allowed the cities to preserve their internal governance and commercial activities. The tribute records of the Assyrian kings, inscribed in stone and recorded in palace annals, provide vivid testimony to these arrangements. They list quantities of silver, gold, cedar, textiles, and luxury goods sent from Phoenician cities to Assyrian capitals. Far from being signs of weakness, these tributes were calculated investments in survival. They bought time, stability, and freedom from destruction. One famous episode that illustrates this policy occurred during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III. When he invaded the Levant in the 8th century BCE, most Phoenician cities quickly submitted and offered gifts. Tyre, however, resisted longer and was besieged. Yet even this conflict ended not in destruction, but in negotiation, and Tyre retained its position under Assyrian suzerainty. This outcome was typical of how the Phoenicians handled imperial threats, not through military strength but through calculated submission and the maintenance of key economic roles that made them too useful to destroy. The Phoenicians also managed their relationships with one another in a similar spirit of pragmatic coexistence. While rivalry between cities, especially between Tyre and Sidon, remained intense, open conflict was rare. Instead, cities competed through trade, colonization, and the cultivation of foreign alliances. When one city, such as Sidon, fell temporarily out of favor with an imperial power, another, like Tyre or Arwad, might step in to fill the gap. In addition to dealing with imperial powers and neighboring states, the Phoenicians also had to manage their relations with indigenous peoples in their colonial territories. In North Africa, for instance, Carthage developed long-standing ties with Berber communities, including trade partnerships and political alliances. These relationships were built on negotiation, mutual interest, and, when necessary, military defense. In the Western Mediterranean, Phoenician settlers interacted with native groups in Sardinia, Sicily, and the Iberian Peninsula. These interactions varied greatly depending on local conditions. In some areas, the Phoenicians integrated peacefully, exchanging goods and intermarrying with locals. In other places, competition over resources or territory led to conflict. Still, the general trend was one of adaptation and accommodation rather than domination. The Phoenician preference for cooperation over conquest made their presence more palatable to many indigenous societies. In time, however, this careful balancing act would be tested by new challenges. The Assyrian Empire would grow more aggressive, and later, Babylonian and Persian rulers would also demand submission. In the Western Mediterranean, Greek colonization introduced a more direct and aggressive competitor to Phoenician interests, particularly in places like Sicily and southern Italy. These encounters would eventually escalate into open conflict. Yet during this middle phase of their history, the Phoenicians excelled at maintaining their independence through diplomacy, commerce, and cultural exchange. They turned their geographical vulnerability into a strength, using their strategic location to connect empires rather than resist them. They developed a reputation as reliable partners, skilled negotiators, and shrewd survivors. This talent for navigating political complexity without provoking destruction is one of the most remarkable features of Phoenician civilization. In a world where might often made right, the Phoenicians showed that influence could be earned through other means, through ships rather than swords, agreements rather than armies. By the 9th century BCE, the independent city-states of Phoenicia faced an inescapable reality: the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This formidable force, based in the heart of Mesopotamia, began to exert pressure on the Levant with increasing intensity. The Assyrians were not content with occasional trade or diplomatic exchange. They sought dominance over the entire Near East. For the Phoenicians, this ushered in an era of uneasy coexistence, heavy tribute, and careful maneuvering beneath the looming shadow of imperial expansion. The Neo-Assyrian Empire first emerged as a dominant power under the leadership of kings such as Ashurnasirpal II and Shalmaneser III. From their capital cities along the Tigris River, such as Kalhu and later Nineveh, these rulers launched sweeping military campaigns westward. Their objectives were clear: to secure access to the Mediterranean, dominate the trade networks that flowed through the Levant, and subjugate the smaller kingdoms and city-states that dotted the region. The Phoenician cities, though economically powerful and culturally rich, were not equipped for prolonged military resistance. Unlike Assyria, they lacked large standing armies and were geographically fragmented. Instead, they turned to the tools they knew best: diplomacy, tribute, and commercial leverage. Ashurnasirpal II, whose campaigns reached the Mediterranean in the early 9th century BCE, recorded his achievements in grand inscriptions. He boasted of receiving tribute from Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Arwad, cities that, rather than facing annihilation, offered gifts of silver, gold, purple cloth, cedar logs, and exotic animals to placate the king. These offerings were not one-time gestures but became institutionalized payments made on a regular basis to preserve autonomy and avoid destruction. This pattern continued under Shalmaneser III, who conducted multiple campaigns into Syria and the Levant. The famed black obelisk of Shalmaneser, discovered in Nimrud, depicts emissaries from numerous western regions bringing tribute. Among them were Phoenician representatives, portrayed as submissive but dignified, bearing luxury items for the Assyrian court. These visual and textual records served both as propaganda and as diplomatic documentation, symbols of power for Assyria and strategic submission for the Phoenicians. Despite their subordination, Phoenician cities retained a surprising degree of internal independence. In return for loyalty and tribute, the Assyrians often allowed local kings to remain on their thrones, provided that they cooperated with imperial directives. This arrangement suited both parties. The Assyrians secured wealth and regional control without the burden of direct administration, while the Phoenicians continued to govern themselves and manage their economic networks. However, the cost of this arrangement was considerable. Tribute demands placed enormous strain on local economies, particularly during times of drought, poor harvest, or conflict with rival states. Cities that delayed or failed to deliver their quotas faced harsh consequences. Assyrian records describe sieges, deportations, and the public execution of rebellious rulers as warnings to others. One of the most prominent examples of Assyrian pressure came during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III in the 8th century BCE. His campaigns into the Levant brought direct confrontations with multiple Phoenician cities. Tyre, initially resistant, was besieged for an extended period. Though the island city was difficult to conquer outright, the siege cut off trade routes and forced negotiations. Eventually, Tyre agreed to pay tribute and maintain peaceful relations, once again preserving its autonomy through diplomacy. In other cases, Phoenician cities were drawn into wider regional conflicts. When neighboring kingdoms such as Israel, Damascus, or Judah rebelled against Assyrian rule, they often sought support from the Phoenician cities or passed through their territories. This placed cities like Sidon and Byblos in precarious positions. Supporting rebellion risked retaliation, while refusing assistance could alienate local allies. The Phoenicians responded with cautious pragmatism, usually avoiding direct involvement in rebellion and focusing on preserving their trade routes and internal stability. The reign of Sargon II marked a turning point. His campaigns intensified the integration of the Levant into the Assyrian administrative system. He replaced disloyal rulers with loyal governors and enforced tighter control over tribute collection. Though many Phoenician cities remained nominally independent, their freedom to maneuver was increasingly restricted. Sennacherib, Sargon's successor, maintained this aggressive policy. He famously destroyed the city of Babylon and waged campaigns across the eastern Mediterranean. Sidon, under its king, Abdi-Milkuti, resisted Assyrian control and was crushed as a result. Sennacherib razed the city, executed its king, and rebuilt it under a new, hand-picked ruler. This event sent a strong message to the rest of Phoenicia. Rebellion would not be tolerated, and submission was the only path to survival. Despite these harsh episodes, Assyrian rule also brought certain benefits to the Phoenicians. Their cities were connected to an imperial road system that facilitated overland trade. Markets expanded as Assyrian-controlled regions opened to Phoenician merchants. Assyrian demand for luxury goods, especially textiles, metalwork, and timber, created profitable opportunities. In a strange paradox, the same empire that limited Phoenician independence also helped stimulate their economy by providing access to vast internal markets stretching from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf. Culturally, the period of Assyrian dominance led to increased exchange. Phoenician art and architecture influenced Assyrian styles, particularly in decorative motifs and temple layouts. In turn, Assyrian symbolism and political ideology made their way into Phoenician inscriptions and public monuments. Religious syncretism also occurred as deities were equated across traditions and rituals were adapted to reflect broader regional trends. The collapse of the Neo-Assyrian Empire at the close of the 7th century BCE marked a seismic shift in the political landscape of the ancient Near East. Where once the Assyrians had dominated the Levant with overwhelming force, a power vacuum now emerged, inviting new contenders to fill the void. Chief among these was the Neo-Babylonian Empire, led by ambitious rulers determined to assert control over the former Assyrian territories. For the Phoenicians, particularly the city of Tyre, this transition brought fresh trials, culminating in one of the longest and most grueling sieges in ancient history. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, centered in Mesopotamia, rose under the leadership of Nabopolassar and reached its zenith under his son, Nebuchadnezzar II. This formidable ruler, who reigned during the first half of the 6th century BCE, was renowned not only for his military campaigns, but also for monumental building projects in Babylon, including the famed Ishtar Gate and the Hanging Gardens, if indeed they existed as later accounts describe. Yet Nebuchadnezzar's ambitions extended far beyond architecture. Like the Assyrians before him, he sought to secure firm control over the western provinces, including the wealthy and strategically vital Phoenician coast. Among all the Phoenician cities, Tyre stood out as the most defiant and the most difficult to conquer. By this time, Tyre had established itself as a maritime powerhouse, commanding extensive trade networks and maintaining strong defensive infrastructure. Its primary urban center was located on an island just off the mainland, protected by fortified walls and accessible only by sea. This natural defense made Tyre a challenging target for any land-based army. Tensions between Babylon and Tyre came to a head early in Nebuchadnezzar's reign. While other Phoenician cities such as Sidon and Byblos submitted to Babylonian authority with relative ease, offering tribute and recognizing Babylonian suzerainty, Tyre resisted. The city's leadership, led by King Ithobal III, calculated that its defenses and naval strength could withstand Babylonian pressure, or at least delay submission long enough to secure more favorable terms. Nebuchadnezzar responded with a campaign of calculated pressure. Historical and biblical sources describe a prolonged siege of Tyre, lasting an extraordinary 13 years. This figure, while debated by modern historians, is supported by multiple ancient accounts and suggests a sustained and brutal effort to bring the city to heel. The siege of Tyre was unlike typical land battles of the era. Babylonian forces could not simply storm the island city. Instead, they blockaded the mainland harbor, severed supply lines, and built siege works to cut off access. The campaign was grueling, both for the besiegers and the besieged. Tyre's access to the sea allowed it to maintain some level of trade and communication, possibly with its colonies and allies. But food shortages, economic strain, and morale would have taken a toll over time. The siege is mentioned in the book of Ezekiel, where the prophet refers to Tyre's resistance and eventual downfall. While religious in tone, these passages reflect the magnitude of the event and the symbolic importance of Tyre's fate. Other records, such as Babylonian chronicles, are more limited, but they confirm that Nebuchadnezzar devoted considerable resources to the campaign. Eventually, the city capitulated, though not through total military conquest. According to historical interpretations, Tyre negotiated terms with Babylon that involved the installation of a puppet ruler or the acknowledgement of Babylonian supremacy in exchange for limited autonomy. The exact details remain unclear, but it is evident that Tyre's political independence was deeply compromised. The kings of Tyre henceforth ruled under the watchful eye of Babylon, and the city's influence began to wane. The outcome of the siege had significant consequences. First, it marked the end of Tyre's dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. Though the city would continue to exist and retain some commercial activity, its days as a leading power were over. Carthage and other western colonies, increasingly independent, filled the void left by Tyre's weakening. This shift accelerated the westward movement of Phoenician influence, as the colonies took on greater political and economic weight in the Phoenician world. Second, the siege contributed to the broader trend of imperial integration in the Near East. Under the Babylonians, Phoenician cities were no longer merely tributary states. They became administrative units within a more centralized imperial system. Governors, appointed with Babylonian approval, oversaw trade, tax collection, and local security. While local customs and religion were tolerated, the loss of full sovereignty was a blow to Phoenician identity. Culturally, the siege left an imprint on the psyche of the region. Tyre had long been viewed as the jewel of the coast, a symbol of Phoenician resilience, wealth, and ingenuity. Its submission was both a military triumph for Babylon and a moment of mourning for the Phoenicians. In later texts, both biblical and classical, Tyre's fall was interpreted as a lesson in pride, endurance, and the limits of resistance. Economically, the siege disrupted trade throughout the region. Tyre's merchant fleets, once dominant, were constrained by Babylonian oversight. The city's role as a distributor of luxury goods diminished, and some trade shifted to other ports under more compliant rulers. Carthage, in particular, capitalized on this moment to expand its commercial dominance, further solidifying its role as the new leader of the Phoenician diaspora. Despite these challenges, the broader Phoenician culture survived. The cities of the Levant continued to serve as centers of craftsmanship, maritime knowledge, and religious tradition. Their writing system remained influential, their deities continued to be worshipped in distant colonies, and their reputation for skilled navigation endured. But in political terms, the age of independent Phoenician city-states in the Levant was drawing to a close. When the Neo-Babylonian Empire fell to the Persians under Cyrus the Great in the year 539 BCE, a new imperial chapter began for the ancient Near East. For the Phoenician cities, this transition from Babylonian domination to Persian rule brought both change and opportunity. Unlike the harsh sieges and tributes of previous empires, the Achaemenid Persians introduced a more flexible and pragmatic approach to governance. The Phoenician cities, with their unrivaled maritime expertise and commercial infrastructure, quickly became vital assets to the Persian imperial system. Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, pursued a policy of relative tolerance and regional autonomy. He recognized the value of local customs, religious institutions, and administrative traditions, especially in lands far from the Persian heartland. This approach would continue under his successors, including Cambyses, Darius the Great, and Xerxes. The Phoenician cities, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Arwad, were integrated into this new imperial framework as semi-autonomous regions, paying tribute but retaining a significant degree of self-governance. One of the key reasons for this autonomy was the Phoenicians' unmatched naval capacity. The Achaemenid Empire, vast and land-based, lacked a strong indigenous naval tradition. As Persian ambitions expanded into the Aegean and across the Mediterranean, they relied increasingly on the Phoenicians to supply ships, sailors, and logistical support. The kings of Sidon and Tyre were not only local rulers but also became admirals and fleet organizers for Persian military campaigns. During the reign of Darius the Great, who ruled from the late 6th into the early 5th century BCE, the Persian Empire undertook major efforts to control the eastern Mediterranean and subdue the rebellious Greek city-states. The Phoenician cities played a crucial role in this campaign. They contributed large numbers of warships and crew members to the Persian fleet that sailed into the Aegean during the first Persian invasion of Greece. These ships were often constructed in Sidon and Tyre, using the famed cedar wood of Lebanon and staffed by experienced sailors who had grown up navigating the sea. Herodotus, the Greek historian writing in the 5th century BCE, provides extensive accounts of these events. He acknowledges the skill and bravery of the Phoenician sailors, even as he frames them as enemies in the broader conflict between Persia and Greece. According to Herodotus, Phoenician ships formed the backbone of the Persian fleet during the battles at Lade and Artemisium, and later during the failed expedition that ended with the Battle of Marathon. Under Xerxes, who launched the second Persian invasion of Greece in the early 5th century BCE, the Phoenicians were once again called upon to provide naval support. They furnished hundreds of ships, contributing significantly to the enormous fleet that crossed the Hellespont and marched into Greek territory. While the campaign ultimately failed, culminating in the naval defeat at Salamis and the eventual Persian retreat, the Phoenicians had demonstrated their indispensable role within the empire's military machinery. Importantly, this military service brought rewards. The Persian kings allowed Phoenician cities to mint their own coinage, maintain their local institutions, and operate without direct interference in day-to-day governance. Sidon, in particular, rose to prominence during this period, becoming the leading city among the Phoenician states. Its kings held prestigious positions within the imperial hierarchy, and the city itself flourished economically and artistically. Archaeological evidence from Sidon in the Persian period supports this narrative. Monumental buildings, royal inscriptions, and extensive cemeteries suggest a city enjoying prosperity and cultural vitality. Royal sarcophagi, such as that of King Eshmunazar, bear inscriptions in Phoenician script that both praise the king's deeds and affirm the city's loyalty to the Persian monarch. These texts reveal a delicate balance, local pride intertwined with imperial allegiance. Tyre, while still influential, did not enjoy quite the same favored status as Sidon during the height of Persian rule. Nevertheless, it remained an essential naval and commercial center. Its shipyards continued to produce high-quality vessels, and its merchants traded goods throughout the empire and beyond. Tyre's kings maintained their positions under Persian oversight, navigating the political landscape with the same pragmatic diplomacy that had preserved the city through Assyrian and Babylonian rule. Phoenician religious traditions also continued with little disruption. The Persians, who practiced Zoroastrianism, did not attempt to impose their beliefs on subject peoples. Temples to Melkart, Astarte, Eshmun, and Baal-Hamon remained active, and religious festivals were held without interference. In fact, some Persian rulers even made offerings to local deities when traveling through Phoenician territory, a gesture of respect that reinforced the peaceful coexistence between empire and city. Economically, the Persian period was a time of expansion for Phoenician trade. With the empire stretching from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea and from the Caucasus to the Nile, Phoenician merchants gained access to one of the largest unified markets in the ancient world. Ships from Tyre and Sidon carried goods such as textiles, glassware, purple dye, and wine to ports across the Mediterranean and beyond. In return, they imported spices, metals, ivory, and exotic animals. This flow of goods enriched the merchant classes and sustained the urban economies of the Phoenician coast. Marketplaces bustled with activity, and the streets echoed with a mix of languages as traders from across the empire came to do business. Coinage minted in Sidon and Tyre featured local symbols but also reflected the broader imperial economy, facilitating exchange and taxation. However, not all was tranquil. The relationship between the Phoenician cities and their imperial overlords was built on mutual interest, not unshakable loyalty. When the Persian Empire suffered defeats or faced rebellions elsewhere, some Phoenician cities explored opportunities to assert greater independence. These efforts were usually short-lived, as Persian military strength remained formidable, but they reveal an undercurrent of tension beneath the surface of cooperation. By the final decades of the 4th century BCE, the ancient world stood at the brink of monumental transformation. The Persian Empire, long a dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean, was weakening under the pressure of a bold and charismatic young conqueror, Alexander of Macedon. Known to history as Alexander the Great, his sweeping military campaigns would not only dismantle the Achaemenid Empire, but also reshape the political and cultural landscape of the Mediterranean and Near East. For the Phoenician city of Tyre, Alexander's arrival marked a fateful turning point. Long admired for its maritime strength and unyielding independence, Tyre had successfully navigated centuries of imperial entanglement, submitting when necessary, resisting when possible. Under Persian rule, it had retained a degree of autonomy in exchange for naval support and tribute. But now, as Alexander advanced along the eastern Mediterranean coast in his campaign to conquer Persia, Tyre was forced to decide once more: resist, submit, or negotiate. Alexander's strategy in the region was clear. After crossing into Asia Minor and defeating Persian forces at the Battle of Issus, he began a steady southward march along the Levantine coast. His objective was to neutralize the Persian navy by denying it access to critical ports and securing his supply lines. The Phoenician cities, with their powerful fleets and strategic harbors, were central to this plan. Some cities quickly submitted. Byblos and Sidon opened their gates to Alexander without resistance. These cities, perhaps weary of Persian oversight or hopeful of favorable treatment under the new power, recognized the shifting tide and aligned themselves with the Macedonian king. In return, Alexander allowed them to maintain internal governance and spared them the destruction that often accompanied military conquest. Tyre, however, was a different matter. Unlike the other coastal cities, Tyre was not built on the mainland but on a fortified island located just offshore. Over the centuries, this island city had been reinforced with massive stone walls, towers, and a dual harbor system. Its insular position had saved it from full-scale conquest many times before, including during the lengthy Babylonian Siege under Nebuchadnezzar II. Tyre's leaders had reason to believe they could hold out again. When Alexander reached Tyre in the year 332 BCE, he did not initially seek war. According to classical sources, including Arrian and Quintus Curtius Rufus, Alexander requested permission to enter the city and offer a sacrifice to Melkart, the Tyrian god whom the Greeks equated with Heracles. His request, though presented with diplomatic politeness, was understood as a political statement. Welcoming Alexander would signal Tyre's submission and recognition of his authority. The Tyrians, aware of what was at stake, refused. They offered to submit to Persia no longer, but insisted on remaining neutral in the conflict. Alexander, unwilling to tolerate a powerful naval base in enemy hands, saw no alternative but to take the city by force. Thus began one of the most remarkable sieges of antiquity, both for its engineering ingenuity and its symbolic significance. The challenge was immense. Tyre's island fortress was inaccessible to land forces, and Alexander initially lacked a strong fleet to match the city's navy. To overcome this, he devised an extraordinary plan. He would build a causeway, a massive stone and timber mole, stretching from the mainland to the island. This unprecedented engineering project would allow his forces to approach the city's walls directly and launch an assault on foot. Construction of the causeway began immediately, using rubble, timber, and earth. At first, progress was steady, but as the structure neared the city, Tyrian forces responded with determination. They launched ships armed with projectiles and fire, harassed the builders from towers, and sent divers to sabotage the foundations underwater. The Tyrians even set fire to part of the mole using a specially outfitted fire ship, causing significant damage. Undeterred, Alexander pressed forward. He brought in ships from Sidon, Byblos, and even Cyprus, many of which had previously served the Persian fleet. With this new naval power, he was able to surround Tyre by sea and protect the construction of the causeway. His engineers reinforced the mole with stone facings to resist fire and rebuilt damaged sections even stronger. After several months of grueling work and constant battle, the causeway reached the island. Alexander's siege engines, battering rams, catapults, and mobile towers were brought forward. Assaults began both by land and sea, with coordinated attacks targeting vulnerable sections of the city walls. Despite fierce resistance from the defenders, Alexander's forces eventually breached the walls on the southern side of the island. Macedonian troops poured into the city, engaging in brutal street fighting. The defenders, exhausted and overwhelmed, could not hold. After approximately 7 months of siege, Tyre fell. The aftermath was harsh. Ancient accounts describe the massacre of many Tyrian citizens and the enslavement of thousands. According to some sources, as many as 2,000 men were crucified along the shore as a warning to others who might resist Alexander's advance. While exact numbers may be exaggerated, the message was unmistakable. Resistance would be met with uncompromising force. Alexander entered the city and finally made his offering to Melkart, as he had initially proposed, though now as a conqueror, not a guest. Tyre's political independence was ended. It was absorbed into the Macedonian domain, and its strategic position would be used in support of Alexander's continued campaigns against Persia. The fall of Tyre had far-reaching consequences. First and foremost, it marked the end of Phoenician independence in the homeland. Though the cities would continue to exist, trade, and contribute to Mediterranean culture, they would never again control their own destiny as sovereign states. From this point forward, they became subjects, first of Macedonia, later of Hellenistic successor kingdoms, and eventually of Rome. Second, the siege symbolized a transition in the ancient world. The city that had resisted Assyria and Babylon had finally succumbed, not to overwhelming numbers, but to ingenuity, persistence, and the rising power of the West. Alexander's conquest of Tyre demonstrated the effectiveness of combined land and naval strategy, as well as the use of engineering in siege warfare. His causeway to the island, though partially dismantled in later centuries, permanently altered the coastline and left a physical legacy that endures to this day. As the political independence of the Phoenician homeland came to an end with the fall of Tyre to Alexander the Great, a new center of Phoenician influence emerged in the western Mediterranean. Carthage, originally a colony of Tyre, had by this time already grown into a thriving and powerful city-state. In the wake of Eastern decline, Carthage assumed the mantle of leadership for the broader Phoenician world. Over the course of the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, it rose from a regional power to become one of the dominant forces in the Western Mediterranean, a maritime republic, economic titan, and military power whose name would eventually become synonymous with resistance to Rome itself. The roots of Carthaginian power lay in its strategic location and economic foresight. Situated on a peninsula in what is now Tunisia, Carthage had access to excellent harbors, fertile hinterlands, and trade routes reaching across North Africa, southern Europe, and the Atlantic. It controlled key maritime choke points and acted as a conduit between inland African markets and Mediterranean seaborne commerce. From its founding in the late 9th century BCE, Carthage had maintained strong ties to Tyre. But as Tyre and the other Phoenician homeland cities fell under foreign rule, first to the Assyrians, then to the Babylonians, Persians, and finally the Macedonians, Carthage increasingly operated independently. Its political structure matured into a unique blend of oligarchy and republicanism, governed not by monarchs but by elected officials known as suffetes, along with a council of elders and a powerful senate composed of aristocratic families. This internal organization provided a foundation for Carthage's expansionist ambitions. Unlike the homeland city-states, which had traditionally focused on trade and diplomacy, Carthage developed the capacity and will to control territory, levy armies, and establish political hegemony. It forged a new model of Phoenician power, one that balanced commerce with military force. By the 4th century BCE, Carthage had extended its influence across a vast region. It controlled coastal settlements in North Africa, stretching from modern-day Libya to Morocco. Its sphere included the fertile lands of Sardinia, parts of western Sicily, and key settlements in southern Spain. These territories provided essential resources: grain, timber, metals, and manpower. Carthaginian expansion was not achieved solely through colonization. The city also developed a complex network of alliances, client relationships, and garrisoned outposts. It negotiated with indigenous peoples, integrated local elites into its political order, and established trade dominance through both persuasion and coercion. In regions such as Iberia, Carthaginian commanders worked closely with local tribes, forming hybrid societies that fused Phoenician and native traditions. One of Carthage's greatest strengths was its navy. Inheriting the seafaring expertise of its Tyrian ancestors, Carthage built one of the most formidable fleets in the ancient world. Its shipyards produced warships and merchant vessels in great numbers, and its sailors were highly trained professionals. Control of the sea lanes allowed Carthage to move troops rapidly, protect its trade routes, and project power across vast distances. Equally important was Carthage's economic base. The city was a major hub of trade, finance, and industry. Its markets bustled with goods from across the Mediterranean: silver from Iberia, ivory and gold from Africa, tin from Britain, and textiles from Italy and Greece. Carthaginian merchants were active in both land and sea trade, and the city maintained a sophisticated system of weights, measures, and contracts. Its economy was supported by a strong agricultural sector, especially in the fertile North African plains surrounding the city, which produced surplus grain for export. Carthage also developed a distinct cultural identity that, while rooted in Phoenician traditions, reflected the realities of its Western environment. Its language remained a variant of Phoenician, often referred to by scholars as Punic. It preserved core religious practices, including the worship of deities such as Baal-Hamon and Tanit. Temples, rituals, and festivals continued to echo those of Tyre and Sidon, though they evolved over time to incorporate regional influences. The city's art and architecture blended Eastern and Western elements, creating a unique aesthetic that included both classical Mediterranean styles and Near Eastern motifs. Burial practices, inscriptions, and civic iconography reveal a society that was both proud of its heritage and deeply engaged with its surroundings. Politically, Carthage was governed by a system that balanced the interests of powerful families with the practical needs of governance. The Suffède, elected magistrates similar in some respects to Roman consuls, served as the city's executive officers. They were responsible for diplomacy, military leadership, and internal administration. The Senate, composed of influential aristocrats, advised the Suffèdes and shaped policy. A popular assembly existed, though its powers were limited compared to those of the elite. This complex political structure allowed Carthage to maintain stability while pursuing ambitious foreign policies. The city's leaders were pragmatic, often choosing alliances and treaties over war. But when necessary, they could act decisively and militarily. Carthage employed a large standing army composed largely of mercenaries, Numidians, Iberians, Gauls, and others, supplemented by citizen soldiers and allied contingents. During the 4th century BCE, Carthage increasingly came into contact and conflict with Greek colonies in the Western Mediterranean. The island of Sicily became a primary theater for this rivalry. Carthaginian forces clashed repeatedly with Greek city-states, particularly Syracuse, in a series of wars that lasted for generations. These conflicts, while costly, solidified Carthaginian control over western Sicily and demonstrated the city's willingness to use military force to defend and expand its interests. Carthage's strategic vision extended beyond war and conquest. It invested heavily in urban infrastructure, public works, and engineering. The city itself was a marvel of planning and construction. Its harbors were meticulously designed, including a large commercial port and a circular military harbor with mooring spaces for warships and facilities for repairs. Its streets were laid out in a grid, and its public buildings reflected both functionality and grandeur. Agricultural innovation was another hallmark of Carthaginian success. Writers such as Mago, a Carthaginian agronomist, composed detailed treatises on farming techniques that were later translated into Latin by the Romans and praised for their insight. Carthaginian farmers developed irrigation systems, crop rotation schedules, and specialized cultivation methods that helped support a large and growing population. As Carthage matured into a Western Mediterranean superpower, its ambitions and influence inevitably collided with those of the Greek world. Nowhere was this rivalry more intense than on the island of Sicily. Positioned between the African and Italian peninsulas, Sicily was a natural crossroads of commerce and conflict. Its rich agricultural lands, strategic harbors, and mosaic of city-states made it a coveted prize. For centuries, it became the main battleground between Carthaginian and Greek interests, a theater of war that would shape the geopolitical landscape long before the rise of Rome as a Mediterranean power. The first Greek colonies in Sicily were established in the 8th century BCE, roughly the same era when Carthage itself was still growing from a Tyrian outpost into a regional power. Cities such as Naxos, Syracuse, Gela, and Acragas were founded by settlers from Corinth, Chalcis, and Rhodes, among other poleis. These Greek cities quickly flourished, bringing with them their political systems, military traditions, and competitive spirit. By the 6th century BCE, these colonies had become prosperous and assertive. Some sought to expand their territory at the expense of local Sicilian peoples or rival Greek cities. Others reached out into southern Italy and even the western Mediterranean. Inevitably, their paths crossed with those of the Phoenician colonies that had long maintained a presence in western Sicily. Unlike the Greeks, Phoenician colonization in Sicily had not aimed for territorial conquest. Settlements such as Motia, Soluntum, and Panormus were commercial outposts. harbors, warehouses, and religious centers that integrated with local communities. As Carthage assumed greater leadership of the Western Phoenician world, it took on responsibility for protecting and managing these outposts. This responsibility eventually drew it into open conflict with the Greeks. The first major confrontation between Carthage and the Greeks of Sicily occurred in the late 6th century BCE during the reign of Malchus, a Carthaginian general and statesman. While this early campaign did not result in lasting territorial change, it set the precedent for Carthaginian involvement in Sicilian affairs. The island was now recognized by both sides as a contested zone of influence. Tensions escalated dramatically in the 5th century BCE with the rise of ambitious Greek tyrants, most notably Gelon of Syracuse. Under Gelon's leadership, Syracuse became the dominant Greek power on the island. Gelon sought to unite Sicily's Greek cities under his rule and viewed the Phoenician presence, especially Carthage's influence, as an obstacle to be removed. The resulting clash culminated in the Battle of Himera in the early 5th century BCE. Carthage, alarmed by Greek expansion, launched a large-scale military expedition to support its allies on the island and counter Syracusan aggression. Led by the general Hamilcar, not to be confused with later Carthaginian leaders of the same name, the Carthaginian force landed in western Sicily and marched toward Himera. What followed was a pivotal moment in early Carthaginian Greek warfare. Gelon met the invaders with a coalition of Greek forces and inflicted a crushing defeat on the Carthaginian army. Hamilcar was either killed in battle or took his own life, depending on the account, and Carthage suffered a humiliating setback. This defeat temporarily halted Carthaginian ambitions in Sicily and led to a period of internal reform within the Carthaginian government and military. Despite this loss, Carthage did not abandon its interests in Sicily. In the following decades, it rebuilt its forces, fortified its holdings, and maintained diplomatic ties with local allies. The city's leaders understood that control of Sicily was essential, not only for protecting Phoenician settlements, but also for securing trade routes and containing Greek expansion. By the end of the 5th century BCE, Carthage had regained its confidence. The emergence of Dionysius I in Syracuse, another powerful and expansionist tyrant, reignited hostilities. Dionysius sought to drive out the Phoenicians entirely and unify the island under Greek rule. In response, Carthage launched a series of massive invasions. One of the most significant of these campaigns occurred under the Carthaginian general Hamilcar, who led a large force into Sicily and achieved major victories, including the capture and destruction of several Greek cities. However, a devastating plague struck the Carthaginian camp during the siege of Syracuse, weakening their forces and forcing a retreat. The war ended in a stalemate, with Carthage retaining control of western Sicily and Syracuse dominating the east. Throughout the 4th century BCE, the pattern of conflict repeated. Carthaginian and Greek forces clashed in a series of wars that ebbed and flowed, with neither side achieving total domination. Carthage maintained its strongholds in Motia, Lilybaeum, and Panormus, while Syracuse and other Greek cities continued to resist. These wars took a heavy toll. Cities were destroyed and rebuilt, populations were displaced, and resources were drained. Yet they also led to innovation in military strategy, naval warfare, and diplomacy. Carthage developed better fortifications, improved its command structure, and learned to adapt its use of mercenary forces. Greek cities, for their part, experimented with new alliances and political arrangements. The struggle for Sicily was more than a series of local wars. It represented a broader clash between two civilizations, each with its own vision of political organization, cultural identity, and economic reach. The Greeks favored independent city-states driven by civic competition, while Carthage represented a centralized, commercially focused republic with a network of colonial dependencies. Despite their rivalry, there were moments of coexistence and mutual influence. Trade continued even during periods of war, and cultural exchange occurred through art, religion, and language. Carthaginian artifacts have been found in Greek cities, and Greek pottery was a common find in Carthaginian markets. In Sicily itself, hybrid communities emerged, blending Greek and Punic elements in architecture, religion, and daily life. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, two powerful civilizations stood on a collision course. On one side was Carthage, the wealthy maritime republic descended from Phoenician settlers. Its influence spread across North Africa, southern Spain, and western Sicily. On the other side was Rome, a fast-rising republic from central Italy, whose military and political ambitions had steadily expanded beyond the Italian peninsula. Their inevitable clash would result in one of the most consequential series of conflicts in ancient history, the Punic Wars. These wars, 3 in total, spanned more than a century and determined the balance of power in the Western Mediterranean. What began as a regional dispute over control of Sicily eventually escalated into full-scale global conflict, involving massive fleets, legendary generals, and dramatic shifts in fortune. For Carthage, it was a final test of resilience. For Rome, it was the gateway to empire. The First Punic War began in the year 264 BCE, sparked by competing interests in Sicily. At that time, Carthage controlled much of western Sicily, while the eastern part of the island remained under the influence of Syracuse and other Greek city-states. Rome, though not yet a naval power, had established itself as the dominant force on the Italian mainland. When a group of mercenaries known as the Maritines appealed to both Rome and Carthage for assistance in their struggle for control of the city of Messana, the two great powers were drawn into direct confrontation. What followed was a war of surprising duration and intensity. Though initially lacking a strong navy, Rome quickly built one, drawing on Greek ship designs and training thousands of sailors. The Romans introduced an innovation known as the corvus, a boarding device that allowed their troops to fight hand-to-hand on enemy ships, effectively turning sea battles into land engagements, where Roman infantry excelled. Carthage, with its long-standing naval tradition, initially held the advantage at sea. But over time, Roman persistence and adaptability shifted the balance. Battles such as Mylae and Ecnomus demonstrated Rome's growing confidence and capability on water. Carthaginian forces, led by skilled commanders like Hamilcar Barca, conducted effective land campaigns, especially in western Sicily. However, Rome's control of key coastal positions and its ability to replenish fleets gave it the strategic edge. After more than 2 decades of fighting, the First Punic War ended in Roman victory. Carthage was forced to cede control of Sicily and pay a heavy indemnity. This marked the first time Carthage lost significant territory, and it signaled the beginning of a new world order. Rome had established itself as a naval power and now held its first overseas province. The defeat was a profound shock to Carthage. Internally, political factions debated how to respond. The ruling oligarchy, dominated by merchant elites, was cautious and commercial in outlook. But a new military family emerged with a more aggressive stance, the Barcids. Hamilcar Barca, who had fought with distinction in the First Punic War, led Carthaginian efforts to rebuild influence, this time not in Sicily, but in Iberia. In the decades that followed, Carthage focused on expanding its territory and resources in the Iberian Peninsula. Hamilcar, followed by his son-in-law Hasdrubal and eventually his son Hannibal, established a powerful Carthaginian presence in southern Spain. They founded cities, exploited silver mines, and built an army loyal to the Barcid family. This buildup was not merely economic. It was a calculated preparation for renewed confrontation with Rome. The Second Punic War erupted in 218 BCE, triggered by the siege of the Spanish city of Saguntum, an ally of Rome. Hannibal, now the commander of Carthaginian forces in Iberia, launched one of the most daring military campaigns in history. Rather than fight Rome in Spain or North Africa, he led his army, including war elephants, across the Alps into northern Italy. The audacity of Hannibal's campaign stunned the Roman world. He won a series of brilliant victories, most famously at the Battle of Cannae, where his forces encircled and destroyed a much larger Roman army. For years, Hannibal remained in Italy, threatening Rome itself and seeking to encourage rebellion among Rome's allies. Despite his tactical genius, Hannibal lacked sufficient reinforcements and political support from Carthage to fully capitalize on his successes. The Carthaginian Senate, cautious and divided, failed to provide the resources needed for a decisive blow. Meanwhile, Rome adapted its strategy, avoiding large confrontations, cutting off Hannibal's supply lines, and gradually reclaiming lost territory. The turning point came when Rome took the fight to Spain and eventually North Africa. Under the leadership of Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus, Roman forces defeated Carthaginian armies in Iberia and forced Hannibal to return home to defend Carthage. In the climactic Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, Scipio defeated Hannibal, ending the Second Punic War. Once again, Carthage was forced to surrender. The terms were even harsher than before. Carthage lost its overseas empire, was prohibited from waging war without Roman approval, and had to pay another massive indemnity. Hannibal, though spared, eventually went into exile and died far from his homeland. The Second Punic War marked the peak and beginning of the end for Carthage as a major power. Though it recovered economically in the following decades, thanks to its industrious population and resilient commercial base, Carthage was now firmly under Rome's shadow. Tensions continued to simmer. Roman politicians, particularly Cato the Elder, viewed Carthage's revival with suspicion. Cato is famously remembered for ending every speech, regardless of topic, with the phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed." His words reflected a growing sentiment in Rome that no peace would be lasting while Carthage still stood. This attitude led directly to the Third Punic War, a short but brutal conflict that began in 149 BCE. Rome accused Carthage of violating treaty terms by defending itself against attacks from neighboring Numidian tribes, despite not seeking Roman permission. The excuse was thin, but the decision had already been made. Rome wanted total destruction. Roman forces, led by Scipio Aemilianus, besieged Carthage. The city, though weakened, resisted fiercely. For 3 years, the Carthaginians defended their walls, fighting street by street, house by house. Men, women, and even children took part in the defense. It was a final act of defiance from a civilization that had once rivaled the greatest powers of its age. The year 146 BCE stands as a solemn marker in ancient history. In that year, the once mighty city of Carthage, descended from Tyrian settlers, cradle of maritime commerce, and proud standard-bearer of Phoenician civilization, was reduced to rubble by Roman arms. Its destruction was not just the end of a single city, but the closing of a chapter in Mediterranean history that had begun nearly a millennium earlier. With Carthage's fall, the last stronghold of Phoenician independence vanished, and with it, a way of life that had helped shape the ancient world. The Third Punic War, though much shorter than the two great conflicts that preceded it, was fueled by decades of animosity, fear, and political pressure within Rome. Many Roman statesmen, particularly Cato the Elder, viewed the mere existence of Carthage as a threat, regardless of its weakened condition. Though Carthage had abided by the humiliating terms imposed after the Second Punic War, remaining disarmed and economically subordinate, it had recovered more swiftly than expected. Its agricultural productivity surged, trade revived, and the city began to reassert itself as a commercial hub. This resurgence, though peaceful, unsettled the Romans. Carthage, for all its past defeats, was still resilient, and resilience, in Roman eyes, was dangerous. The final excuse for war came when Carthage responded militarily to incursions by the neighboring Numidian kingdom of Massinissa, a Roman ally. Although Carthage's actions were defensive in nature, Rome used the event to declare war. The Romans presented Carthage with an ultimatum: surrender hostages, hand over all weapons, and prepare to relocate the population inland, abandoning the coast. This final demand, intended to strip Carthage of its maritime identity, was unacceptable. The Carthaginians, though outmatched, chose resistance over humiliation. Thus began the Siege of Carthage, led by Roman general Scipio Aemilianus, grandson by adoption of the famed Scipio Africanus. The Roman army, seasoned and well-supplied, encircled the city by land and sea. Carthage, heavily fortified and filled with a determined populace, braced for the inevitable assault. For nearly 3 years, the city held out. Despite limited supplies and lack of external support, the Carthaginians mounted a fierce and resourceful defense. They rebuilt weapons, fashioned makeshift war machines, and launched sorties against the Roman lines. Citizens of all ages participated. Women wove cords for catapults, children carried stones, men fought in the streets and along the walls. The defenders' tenacity shocked their Roman adversaries. According to ancient sources, the Carthaginians converted temples into workshops, melted down household bronze for weapons, and even repurposed public monuments into war material. Starvation, disease, and relentless bombardment did not break their resolve. Eventually, the Roman siege engines breached the outer defenses. What followed was a slow, brutal conquest of the city, block by block. Carthaginian fighters barricaded streets, ambushed Roman troops, and retreated deeper into the city's interior. The fighting extended for days, with heavy casualties on both sides. Fires raged, buildings collapsed, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the narrow alleys. When the final resistance fell, the Roman response was unyielding. The surviving population, estimated in the hundreds of thousands before the war, was slaughtered or sold into slavery. The city itself was looted and then systematically destroyed. Its harbor installations were dismantled, its temples razed, and its records and libraries lost to flames or neglect. Though the story of Rome salting the earth to prevent future habitation is likely a myth, it reflects the psychological weight the destruction of Carthage held for both Romans and later generations. The site of the city was cursed, symbolically and literally, and remained uninhabited for decades until it was eventually refounded by the Romans under the rule of Julius Caesar and Augustus. With the fall of Carthage, the last significant outpost of Phoenician political power disappeared. Other cities along the Phoenician coast, such as Tyre and Sidon, had long since been absorbed into successive empires, Persian, Macedonian, and now Roman. While some maintained limited local autonomy and continued to serve as trading centers, none retained the independence or influence they once wielded. Culturally, the destruction of Carthage did not entirely erase the Phoenician legacy. The Punic language, a Western dialect of Phoenician, continued to be spoken in North Africa for centuries after the city's fall. In rural areas around former Carthaginian territory, inscriptions in Punic script persisted, and religious practices adapted from Phoenician models lingered. Roman writers noted the endurance of old rites, sometimes with suspicion or amusement. Elements of Phoenician religious tradition survived as well. The deities Baal, Hammon, and Tanit, though demonized by Greek and Roman authors, continued to be honored in localized forms. Sacred symbols, such as the crescent and disc motif and the open hand, appeared in Roman North Africa and beyond. The Phoenician contribution to the ancient world was never limited to Carthage alone. The alphabet they developed centuries earlier in the Levant continued its long journey, adapted by the Greeks, passed on to the Etruscans, and eventually adopted by the Romans. This writing system, revolutionary in its simplicity and utility, remains the foundation of many modern scripts used today. Their innovations in shipbuilding, navigation, and long-distance commerce influenced generations of sailors and merchants. Even the urban planning and agricultural techniques refined in Carthage found their way into Roman practice. Writers such as Pliny the Elder and Columella preserved fragments of Carthaginian agricultural knowledge in Latin translations, particularly those derived from the now-lost works of Mago, a famed Carthaginian agronomist. Though the political independence of the Phoenician world ended with the destruction of Carthage and the absorption of its eastern cities into successive empires, the Phoenicians' influence did not vanish with their decline. Instead, their cultural, technological, and linguistic legacy endured, often invisibly yet profoundly, woven into the foundations of the classical and modern worlds. One of the most enduring contributions of the Phoenicians was their alphabet. Emerging during the 2nd millennium BCE in the Levant, the Phoenician script was a revolutionary departure from the more complex writing systems of the ancient Near East. It was a true phonetic alphabet based on sounds rather than ideas or syllables, and consisted of 22 characters, all consonants. This simplicity allowed it to be easily learned, replicated, and adapted. Unlike the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia or the hieroglyphs of Egypt, which were controlled by a narrow elite of scribes and priests, the Phoenician alphabet had the potential to democratize literacy. Merchants, sailors, artisans, and administrators could use it with relative ease. As Phoenician traders spread across the Mediterranean, from the Levant to Cyprus, from Carthage to Cadiz, their writing system traveled with them. The Greeks encountered the Phoenician alphabet likely by the late 9th or early 8th century BCE. They adapted it, adding vowels to accommodate the phonetic structure of their language. This adaptation eventually evolved into the Greek alphabet, which in turn laid the foundation for the Latin alphabet, the Cyrillic script, and others. Today, the alphabet used in most modern languages, including English, Spanish, French, and German, can trace its ancestry directly to this Phoenician innovation. This legacy is not just linguistic, it is philosophical. The very idea that complex thoughts could be reduced to a simple, abstract code of written symbols and shared widely changed the nature of communication, governance, commerce, and culture. From treaties to poetry, from contracts to philosophy, the alphabetic system opened new pathways for human expression. In the realm of navigation and maritime trade, the Phoenicians left another significant mark. Their shipbuilding techniques, refined over centuries, were among the most advanced in the ancient world. They designed sturdy, fast, and maneuverable vessels, capable of sailing long distances and withstanding rough seas. These ships featured a combination of sails and oars, allowing for versatility in both open water and coastal navigation. The Phoenicians pioneered many aspects of seafaring knowledge, including coastal mapping, the use of stars for navigation, and the practice of establishing way stations along trade routes. Their maritime network connected dozens of harbors across the Mediterranean, forming a kind of commercial lattice that allowed for the rapid movement of goods, information, and people. Their trade routes introduced new materials and products to distant shores. Phoenician merchants brought tin from Britain, silver from Iberia, ivory from sub-Saharan Africa, spices from Arabia, and textiles from the Levant. In return, they exported glassware, ceramics, cedar timber, and the famed purple dye made from the murex snail, a color so costly and rare that it became associated with royalty and religious elites throughout the ancient world. Culturally, the Phoenicians served as intermediaries between civilizations. They carried not just goods, but also myths, technologies, and artistic motifs. Through their interactions with Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and later Rome, they acted as translators, bridging the gaps between different societies and fostering a kind of early cosmopolitanism. Elements of Phoenician art and architecture appeared in Greek and Etruscan contexts. Religious symbols such as the solar disk, the palm tree, and the open hand crossed cultural boundaries. The Phoenician goddess Astarte influenced Greco-Roman representations of goddesses such as Aphrodite and Venus. The deity Melkart of Tyre bore similarities to Heracles and in fact was often equated with him in classical literature. Religious syncretism was common in the ancient Mediterranean, and the Phoenicians were central to these processes. Their colonies and trading posts often contained temples not only to their own gods, but also to local deities, with rituals adapted to local customs. This flexibility helped promote peaceful integration in many places and allowed Phoenician culture to endure in diverse forms long after its political structures had disappeared. The legal and political ideas of the Phoenicians, though less well documented than their economic and religious practices, also left traces. Carthage in particular developed a republican model of governance that was admired by later Roman authors. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BCE, praised Carthage's mixed constitution, its balance between elite rule and popular input, and its relative stability over time. While the destruction of Carthage by Rome was comprehensive, it did not entirely erase the Punic identity. In rural North Africa, Punic continued to be spoken for centuries. Inscriptions in Punic and hybrid dialects have been found dating into the Roman period and beyond. St. Augustine, writing in the late 4th and early 5th century CE, referred to Punic as still being spoken by many of his North African contemporaries. Moreover, Roman North Africa, while politically Romanized, retained many elements of its Punic past. Agricultural techniques, religious practices, and local social structures often reflected continuity with earlier traditions. Even in the Roman cities built atop former Punic sites, such as Carthage itself, the ghosts of the past remained visible in stone, soil, and memory. The legacy of the Phoenicians extended beyond the classical period. In medieval Islamic scholarship, references to Phoenician contributions to astronomy, navigation, and geography were preserved and studied. During the Renaissance, European antiquarians and historians began to rediscover the role of the Phoenicians in shaping the ancient Mediterranean world. In modern times, the memory of the Phoenicians has been reclaimed and celebrated, particularly in Lebanon and Tunisia, successor states to the ancient heartlands of Phoenicia and Carthage. Archaeological discoveries in Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Carthage have revealed a rich and complex civilization whose influence was far greater than the limited textual sources would suggest. The name Phoenicia itself, derived from the Greek phoenix, a reference to the red-purple dye the people were known for, was never how the Phoenicians referred to themselves. They identified by their cities, Tyrians, Sidonians, Biblians, and yet, as a collective cultural and economic phenomenon, their shared practices and connected worldview gave birth to one of the most influential forces in antiquity. Today, the spirit of the Phoenicians lives on not only in the alphabet we use, but in the idea of the connected world they helped create. Their seafaring trade routes anticipated modern globalization. Their emphasis on commerce, cultural exchange, and adaptation reminds us that power in history does not always come from conquest, but often from cooperation and connection. As we near the conclusion of this journey, the final section will reflect on the historical significance of the Phoenicians in the broader context of world history, how their legacy fits into the rise and fall of civilizations, and why, even now, they remain a key to understanding the ancient world.